Eleanor Whitmore pressed the closed ledger flat against her chest, the way another woman might hold a child, and did not let her hands shake, not once, even as the Duke's voice cut across the great hall and named her the ugliest, least wanted woman in the room. She did not weep. She did not run. She only lowered her chin a half-inch so the gray hood hid her eyes and let them laugh. Because every one of them was laughing at a girl they had never once bothered to see. And she knew something they didn't. If you're watching this, do me one small kindness. Tap, subscribe, and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end, because the ending will stay with you. And leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled tonight. Now let's begin. The invitation had said dinner, and a matter of consequence. Nobody in Ashcroft Hall had said the words bride auction, but that is what it was, and everyone standing under the tall summer windows knew it. Eleanor Whitmore knew it best of all. She had come because her father made her come. Old Silas Whitmore could no longer walk the length of his own porch without a man on each side, and the physicians in Boston had stopped pretending otherwise. And so, when the summons arrived from the great English Duke, who had bought half the valley, Silas had gripped his daughter's wrist with a strength that surprised them both. "You'll go," he'd said. "You'll stand where they can see you." "Father, you'll go, Eleanor. For the family." For the family. She had heard that phrase her whole life, and it had never once meant for her. So she stood now near the marble staircase at the far end of the hall, in a plain gray traveling dress and a plain gray hood pulled forward, and she watched the daughters of Massachusetts's finest families arrange themselves like cut flowers under the candlelight. There were maybe a dozen of them. Powell girls, Bradstreet girls. The Vale heiress gloved to the elbow, laughing at something that wasn't funny. They had come dressed for war silk the color of crushed roses, pearls at the throat, hair pinned up in coils that had taken hours in other women's hands. They had come to be chosen. Eleanor had come to be counted and then forgotten. That was the arrangement. Her father owed the Duke money, a great deal of money, and a Whitmore face at the Duke's gathering was a form of payment, a way of saying, "We honor you, we are still worth your notice." She was a coin laid on a table. She understood that. She had made her peace with it on the long carriage ride somewhere between Grief and the 3rd mile of dust. What she had not made her peace with was the ledger under her arm. Nobody had noticed the ledger. Nobody ever noticed anything Eleanor carried. It was a slim thing, bound in cracked calf leather, and it did not belong in a ballroom, and she had brought it anyway because her father's affairs were her affairs now, and there were numbers inside it that had kept her up for 4 nights running. "Do you see him?" a voice whispered nearby. One of the Powell girls to her sister. "He hasn't looked at a single one of us." "He will. He's supposed to choose Anne. That's the whole—" Hush. Eleanor did see him. The Duke stood across the hall with 2 other men, and he had the particular stillness of a man who has never in his life had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Nathaniel Ashcroft, 32 years old, English by blood, American by land, cold by choice. He wore black when everyone else wore color, and he held a glass of wine he did not drink, and when the older gentlemen around him laughed, he did not. He was not looking at the young women. He was looking at a folded paper in his own hand, and his jaw was tight, and Eleanor, who had spent her whole life reading faces, because faces were the only thing nobody guarded around a girl, they'd decided didn't matter, thought. That is not the face of a man choosing a wife. That is the face of a man losing an argument. Your Grace. An older man, Councilman Hartley, she thought one of the Boston aristocrats who trailed the Duke like gulls behind a fishing boat, clapped his hands once softly, and the hall began to quiet. "Your Grace, the company is assembled. Whenever you're ready to make your introductions." The Duke did not look up from the paper. "There's no need for introductions," he said. The words carried. They always did in a room built to carry a rich man's voice. "I'm sorry," said Hartley. "I said there's no need." The Duke folded the paper once more and slid it into his coat, and now he looked up and his gaze moved across the assembled young women the way a man's eyes move across a stack of firewood, measuring uninterested, already bored. I've read the letters your father sent. I know the acreage. I know the debts. I know which of you can dance and which of you can sing, and which of you has been promised elsewhere and is here to raise her price." The Vale heiress stopped laughing. "Your Grace," Hartley said carefully, "these are the daughters of the finest." "They are collateral," the Duke said. "Let's not pretend otherwise. Every man in this valley owes me something, and every man in this valley has sent me a daughter, and I am expected to be flattered." He set his untouched wine on the tray of a passing servant without looking at the servant. "I am not flattered. I am tired. I have a ship's contract to settle before the tide, and a brother in London who's decided my land is his, and I do not have the evening to spend admiring pearls." Nobody breathed. Eleanor watched a Bradstreet girl's chin begin to tremble. "So let me be plain," the Duke went on, "since plainness seems to frighten this room. I require a wife. Not a companion. Not a— what is the word your poets use, a helpmeet? A wife. Someone to carry the Ashcroft name, produce an heir before my brother can contest the estate, and otherwise remain out of my sight and out of my ledgers. That is the whole of the position. There is no romance in it. There is no future in it beyond function." Hartley had gone gray. Surely one of these lovely young— "The lovely young women," said the Duke, "are the problem." He began to walk. He walked slowly down the line of them, and Eleanor watched the young women straighten one by one as he passed spines going stiff breaths, held hope and terror wound so tight together you couldn't have told them apart. "You?" the Duke said, stopping before the Vale heiress. "Margaret Vale, beautiful. Your father's told half of Boston. You'd expect to be admired. You'd expect a household arranged around your comfort. You'd expect love eventually because girls who look like you always do, and when it didn't come, you'd make my house a misery until it did." He moved on. "No." Margaret Vale's face went white, then red. "You? A Powell girl. Charming. Musical. Your mother's trained you like a hunting dog to be pleasant. And you'd be pleasant and pleasant and pleasant, and I would spend the rest of my life not knowing a single true thing you ever thought. No." He walked. "You'd weep. A Bradstreet girl. You'd want to be understood. No. A step. You'd want to be seen. No. A step. You'd want to matter." He stopped, and something almost like disgust crossed his face. "You would all want to matter. That is the trouble with a beautiful wife. She has been told her whole life that she matters, and so she spends her whole life demanding proof of it, and I have no proof to give. I have land. I have a name. I have a brother trying to take both. I have no time for a woman who needs to be told she is the center of the world." The silence in the hall had gone from stunned to something worse. Something injured the particular quiet of a dozen fathers' daughters being weighed and found too valuable, which is a strange and terrible way to be rejected. And then the Duke's eyes reached the far end of the hall and stopped, on the plain gray hood by the staircase. "Who," he said, "is that?" Every head in the room turned. Eleanor did not move. "Ah," said Hartley, and there was relief in it, and something uglier under the relief. That would be the Whitmore girl, Your Grace. Silas Whitmore's daughter. He's the family has fallen on difficult times. You understand, the debts, the illness we hadn't expected." "Whitmore," the Duke repeated. "The name is on my ledgers." "Yes, Your Grace. Considerably." "And this is his daughter?" "His eldest, yes. I believe there's only the one now." The Duke tilted his head. "Why is she wearing a hood indoors?" The question hung there, and into the silence, a woman's voice Eleanor never did learn, whose offered the answer everyone was thinking in a stage whisper meant to be heard. "Because you wouldn't want to see what's underneath, Your Grace." The hall laughed. Not all of it. But enough. Enough that the sound rolled toward Eleanor like weather, and she felt it break against the gray wool of her hood, and she did not flinch, though every muscle in her body wanted to. Let them, she told herself. Let them laugh. Laughing men don't count what's in your hands. The Duke did not laugh. He looked at the hood for a long moment, and then he did the cruelest thing a man in that room could have done, And he did it without any heat at all, which made it worse. He smiled. "The plain one," he said. Eleanor's fingers closed on the ledger's edge. "Your Grace," said Hartley. "You heard me?" The Duke turned back to the room, and his voice rose easy and cold, so that the last soul in the last corner would catch every word. "The plain one will do." The gasp went through the crowd like a knife through silk. "She has no suitors." The Duke went on, ticking the points off as if reading a receipt. "I checked before I came. No one has ever offered for her. No influence the family's ruined. No beauty worth negotiating over, or she wouldn't be hiding it under a hood in a room full of women who aren't." He nodded once, as though satisfied by his own arithmetic. "She won't expect love because no one's ever given her cause to. She won't demand to be seen because she's spent her life learning not to be. She'll be grateful. She'll be quiet. She'll stay out of my sight." He spread his hands. "Perfect." And Margaret Vale, humiliated, furious, needing someone lower than herself to stand on, laughed out loud, a bright, brittle laugh, and said, "Her, he chose her." "He must be joking," someone said. "He can't mean it. Silas Whitmore's plain little, the ugly one." The word went around the room. Ugly, ugly, ugly. It found every corner. It settled on Eleanor like ash. The Duke had already turned away. He'd said his piece. The matter was decided. He was reaching into his coat for the folded paper again. The ship's contract, the argument he was actually losing because Eleanor Whitmore was a problem he had just solved and no longer needed to think about. "Draw up the terms," he told Hartley. "I want it done before I sail. Marriage of contract. I'll not need to see her before Your Grace." Eleanor's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the first thing she had said since she entered the hall, and there is a particular power in the first words of someone everyone has decided is silent. The room heard it, the way you hear a door open in an empty house. The Duke stopped. He did not turn around. "Yes." "You've made a mistake in your arithmetic." Now he turned. "I beg your pardon. Your arithmetic," Eleanor said. "You said my family is ruined. It's a reasonable thing to assume. It's even mostly true. But you said it as though it were the reason I'm no trouble, and that's where your sum comes out wrong." Hartley made a small strangled sound. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps this isn't the—" "No," the Duke said. "Let her speak." He was looking at the hood now with something new in his face. Not interest, not yet, but the alertness of a man who's heard a floorboard creak behind him. "Go on. My arithmetic." "You have my father's debts on your ledger," Eleanor said. "You've read the numbers. You know how much he owes you. That's why you called it considerable." She paused. "Do you know why he owes you so much, Your Grace? Because he's a poor manager and a worse gambler, I'd imagine. Like every man in this valley." A soft sound moved through the crowd. Half a laugh quickly swallowed, because nobody could tell yet which way this wind was blowing. "He's neither," Eleanor said. "My father hasn't touched a card in 20 years, and he managed his land better than any man on the council until the fever took his legs. The reason he owes you so much money, Your Grace, is that 11 months ago, someone rewrote the terms of his loan. Someone changed the rate. Someone added a clause. The original agreement never had a clause that says the debt compounds each season instead of each year." She let that sit. "Do you know who signed that clause on your behalf?" "Your Grace, because I do. It's in your ledger, and it's in mine, and the two don't match, and I've spent 4 nights working out which one is the lie." For the first time all evening, Nathaniel Ashcroft looked at her. Truly, looked the way he had not looked at the pearls, or the silk, or the trembling Bradstreet chins. "You," he said slowly, "keep your father's books. I keep my father's books." Eleanor said, "Because my father can no longer hold a pen, and my brother is dead, and there is no one else. I have kept them for a year and a half. I know every debt this family owes and every debt owed to it. I know which of your councilmen have their hands in your accounts, and I know which of them think a sick old man's daughter can't count." She lifted the slim leather ledger just slightly so the candlelight caught the cracked spine. I brought proof. I didn't come here to be chosen, Your Grace. I came because my father made me. But since I'm here, and since you've decided I'll do, you should know what you're actually buying." The hall had gone so quiet, Eleanor could hear the candles. Margaret Vale was not laughing anymore. "And now," Eleanor said, "I'll lower the hood, not because you asked, because I want you looking at my face when I tell you the rest." She reached up with one gloved hand, and she lowered the plain gray hood. The entire court stopped breathing, because what they had expected, what the word ugly had painted in every one of their minds, was not what stood there under the candlelight. There was no scar. There was no deformity. There was a young woman of 25 with a plain, clear, unpainted face and steady gray eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that the world will underestimate her and has decided to let it right up until the moment it costs the world too much. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. She had never been. But she was all at once the only woman in the room anyone was looking at. And Nathaniel Ashcroft, who prided himself on reading people who had just read A Dozen Daughters of Massachusetts down to the bone, found that he could not read this one at all. "You're not," someone began and didn't finish. "No," Eleanor said, not to them. To him. "I'm not." The Duke's voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "What is your name? You already said it. You said the plain one. You said the ugly one. You said she'll do." A muscle moved in Eleanor's jaw, the only crack, the only place the 4 nights and the long carriage ride and the whole cruel evening showed through. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I'll do, Your Grace. I'll do very well, but not the way you meant it." For a long moment, nobody in Ashcroft Hall moved. Then Hartley, poor frightened Hartley, who had wanted only for the evening to go smoothly and would now be dining out on its ruin for a year, cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he managed, "perhaps the young lady and his Grace might speak privately about the matter of the ledgers, and we might, the rest of the company might—" "Yes," the Duke said. He had not taken his eyes off Eleanor. "Send them home." "Your Grace, some of them have traveled." "Send them home, Hartley." And so the finest daughters of Massachusetts were sent home. They filed out in a rustle of insulted silk, and some of them stared at Eleanor as they passed, and some of them refused to, and Margaret Vale stopped in front of her for one long poisonous moment, and looked her up and down and said low, so only Eleanor could hear it, "Whatever you think you've won tonight, enjoy it. Girls like you don't get to keep things." "I'm not trying to keep anything," Eleanor said. "I'm trying to save my father's house. You wouldn't understand the difference. You've never had to." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had been beautiful her whole life, and it had made her a great many things, but it had never made her patient, and so she leaned in, and her voice dropped lower still. "You think you're clever. You think a book of numbers makes you safe. Let me tell you something about the Duke Plain Girl. He doesn't keep what he can't own. And he can't own you if you keep talking. You've made yourself a problem tonight. Men like him solve problems." She straightened, and her voice went sweet and bright and public again. "Congratulations on your engagement." Then she was gone, and the hall was empty, and it was only the two of them. Eleanor and the Duke, and a handful of servants along the walls trying very hard to be furniture. The Duke walked toward her. He stopped an arm's length away, which for a man like him was a great concession of ground. "That," he said, "was either the bravest thing I've ever watched or the most reckless. I haven't decided which." "They're usually the same thing," Eleanor said. "For women. We don't get the luxury of choosing brave and safe both." Something flickered in his face. He filed it away, she watched him file it away, and moved on. "You said someone rewrote your father's loan." "I did." "You said the terms compound seasonally." "They do. 4 times a year instead of once. It's why the debt's grown the way it has. My father thinks he simply fell behind. He blames himself. It's eating him faster than the fever is." Her voice didn't waver, but it changed, went lower and harder, and this was the first true thing she'd let the room see, not the numbers, but why the numbers mattered. "I'm not here to marry you, Your Grace. Let's neither of us pretend I've been swept off my feet. I'm here because you hold a piece of paper that's killing my father, and I intend to find out who forged it, and I would rather do that from inside your house than outside it." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "You'd marry a man you don't know," he said, "and move into a house you don't trust to catch a thief. I'd do considerably worse than that for my father. But yes, that's a remarkable thing to admit to the man you'd be marrying. You told a room full of strangers you wanted a wife you'd never have to look at," Eleanor said. "I don't think either of us is much for pretending. That may be the one thing we have in common." And Nathaniel Ashcroft, who had walked into that hall certain he was buying a quiet, grateful, invisible woman, laughed. It surprised him. She could see that it surprised him. He stopped almost as soon as he started, as though the sound had escaped without permission, and his face closed again. But it had happened, and they had both heard it, and Eleanor tucked it away the way she tucked away everything. This one laughs, rarely, against his will. Remember it. "Show me the ledger," he said. "Not here." "Miss Whitmore." "Not here, Your Grace. Look around you." She didn't raise her voice, but her eyes moved deliberate to the servants along the wall, and his followed. "You said you had a councilman with his hand in your accounts. You said it as though it were a thing you already suspected. I'd wager you've suspected it for months and couldn't prove it. I can prove it. But not in a room where the walls have ears, and half those ears report to whoever it is that's robbing you." She lowered her hand from where it had held the hood, smoothed her plain gray skirt, and looked at him steadily. "I'll show you in daylight, in a room you trust, with the door shut, and then you can decide whether the plain one will still do." For a long moment the Duke studied her. "You keep saying that," he said. "The plain one will do. You're throwing my own words back at me." "They were unkind words," Eleanor said. "I thought you should have to hear how they sound in another mouth. That's all. I don't intend to forgive them tonight. Maybe not ever. But I do intend to marry you if the terms are right, because your name is the only wall high enough to keep my father's house from being taken, while I hunt the man who's stealing from us both." She paused. "So, daylight. The ledger. Shall I have my things sent for, or would you rather sleep on the humiliation first?" The Duke looked at her a long, long moment. Then, and this was the thing the servants would whisper about for weeks, the thing that traveled down to the kitchens and out to the stables, and eventually somehow all the way back to Boston, the great cold Duke of the Valley, who had never once bowed to anyone in that house, inclined his head. It was barely an inch, but it was a bow. "Have your things sent for Miss Whitmore," he said. "We'll speak in the morning." And he turned and walked out of his own hall and left her standing alone in the candlelight, holding a cracked leather ledger against her chest like something precious. And it was only then, only when the great doors had shut and there was no one left to see, that Eleanor Whitmore let herself close her eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to let the tremble she'd been holding all evening move through her hands and out. For the family, she thought. For father. For the house. And then, because there was no one left to see it, she let herself think one more thing quieter, the thing she'd never say out loud to a soul, and for the girl who stood by that staircase and let them call her ugly, and counted their laughter, and waited. The room they gave her was in the east wing, far from the Duke's, which was exactly as he'd promised, out of my sight, out of my ledgers. Eleanor understood the geography of the choice and did not object to it. She had not come for nearness. She had come for a locked door and a year and a half of her own numbers and one signature that didn't match. She was still awake when the knock came well past midnight. She'd known it would. "Come in, Mrs. Doyle," she said before the door opened. The housekeeper stopped on the threshold, startled. She was a broad-weathered woman with the flat, wary eyes of someone who has served a cold house a long time and learned to give nothing away. "You knew it was me. You've been standing outside for a while, long enough to change your mind twice." Eleanor set down her pen. "You came to look at me. Everyone did tonight, but you're the only one who waited till I was alone." That means you wanted to see the real thing, not the story. Sit down. You look tired. Mrs. Doyle did not sit, but she came in and she shut the door and she looked at Eleanor for a good while. They're saying downstairs you unmade the whole evening, she said. Sent a Duke's marriage market home with a book of sums. They're exaggerating. Are they? A little. Eleanor smiled, faint and tired. Mostly I just stopped pretending I couldn't count. It didn't take much. That's the trouble with being underestimated, Mrs. Doyle. It's a very low wall to climb over. People give you all the room in the world because they're certain you can't use it. The housekeeper's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the shadow of where one might grow. You'll want to be careful, she said. In this house. Careful who you talk to. Careful what you write in that book and where you leave it. I don't leave it anywhere, Eleanor said. It doesn't leave my hands. But I thank you for the warning. You didn't have to give it, which makes me want to ask you a question, if you'll allow it. Ask. How long has money been going missing from this estate? The housekeeper went very still. I don't know what you... You do, though. You run this house. Nobody knows where a house's money goes better than the woman who has to make it stretch. And there's a wrongness in the accounts here. I could feel it before I'd read a line of them, the same way you can feel damp in a wall before you find the rot. His Grace feels it too. It's why he's cold as January and twice as tired. A man doesn't guard his ledgers like that unless he's already been robbed once. Eleanor leaned forward. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone, Mrs. Doyle. I'm asking you to tell me whether I'm imagining it. That's all. Am I imagining it? The silence stretched. And then Mrs. Doyle, who had served the Ashcrofts for 19 years, who had watched the money bleed and held her tongue because a housekeeper who accuses the wrong man ends up in a ditch, said very quietly, No, miss, you're not imagining it. Eleanor nodded slowly. She'd known. But knowing a thing and hearing it, confirmed by someone with everything to lose, were different weights, and she felt the second one settle on her. How much? I couldn't say to the penny, but the grocer's bills come to me 3 times what the food that reaches my kitchen could ever cost. The stable's the same. The timber. Every account that passes through a certain man's hands comes out swollen on the far side. Mrs. Doyle's jaw tightened. I've watched it for 2 years. I've said nothing. You'll understand why. I understand exactly why. Eleanor's voice gentled. You've a family. A woman who talks in a house like this can lose her place, and a woman who loses her place at your age doesn't find another. You did the only thing you could. You survived. There's no shame in surviving, Mrs. Doyle. I've done nothing else for 2 years myself. Something in the housekeeper's face broke open just slightly. Perhaps it had been a long time since anyone had told her that surviving wasn't the same as cowardice. This certain man, Eleanor said, whose hands the accounts pass through, would his name happen to be on his Grace's ledger as the one who witnesses the loan agreements, the one who drew up my father's terms? Mrs. Doyle looked at her a long moment. Reed, she said finally. Mr. Calvin Reed, the solicitor. He handles his Grace's papers, his contracts, his loans. He's been with the family longer than I have. She paused. He's the one told his Grace which daughters to invite tonight, miss. He's the one drew up the terms of your marriage this very evening in the little office off the West Hall before you'd even said yes. Eleanor sat back. Well, she said softly. Isn't that interesting? Because here was the shape of it, at last, the shape she'd felt for 4 sleepless nights but couldn't quite see. A solicitor who witnessed the loans. A solicitor who could change a rate. Add a clause, make a season out of a year. A solicitor who swelled the household accounts and pocketed the difference. A solicitor who had just this very evening been trusted to write the terms of a marriage, which meant he'd have written those terms to suit himself. Buried something in the plain language that a grateful, quiet, invisible wife would never think to read. He hadn't planned on Eleanor. Nobody ever planned on Eleanor. That was the whole of her power. That was the low wall. Mrs. Doyle, she said, I'm going to ask you for one thing, and then I'm going to let you go to bed. Because you look as though you haven't slept properly in 2 years, and I suspect that's precisely true. What thing? The marriage terms Mr. Reed drew up tonight. His Grace will present them to me in the morning as though they're settled. I'd like to have read them before then. Eleanor's gray eyes were very steady. Not to change them. Not yet. Just to know what a thief writes when he thinks the woman signing can't read past her own name. Can you get them for me for an hour? I'll have them back before dawn and no one the wiser. The housekeeper hesitated at the very edge of the thing, the edge past which a servant becomes something else, an accomplice. A woman who has chosen a side in a war she can't win. If I'm caught, you won't be. And if by some ill luck you are, you'll say I ordered it, and that as the future mistress of this house I'd every right to see my own marriage contract, which is nothing but the truth. The blame lands on me, Mrs. Doyle. Not you. I'll not let it land on you. Eleanor held her gaze. I've had enough of watching the people who do the surviving take the fall for the people who do the stealing. Get me the papers. Let me carry this. It's what I came here to carry. For a moment more, the housekeeper stood there, weighing 19 years of silence against one plain-faced girl who'd walked into a Duke's Hall and refused to be small. Then she nodded. You're not what they said you were, Mrs. Doyle said. Down in that hall. You're not the plain one at all, are you? Oh, I am, Eleanor said. I'm exactly the plain one. That's the whole trick of it. Nobody watches the plain one. Nobody counts what she carries. Nobody thinks to wonder what she knows. She picked up her pen again. Get me the papers, Mrs. Doyle. And thank you. You've done a braver thing tonight than anyone who wore silk to it. The housekeeper left. Eleanor sat alone in the candlelight in the far east wing of a house that did not want her married in all but name to a man who'd called her ugly in front of the whole county, hunting a thief through a stack of numbers with nothing but a cracked leather ledger and a mind nobody had thought to fear. She should have been afraid. Any sensible woman would have been. Instead, she felt for the first time in a year and a half something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. She felt awake. Down the long, dark corridors of Ashcroft Hall, in the cold, clean room where he did not sleep. Nathaniel Ashcroft stood at his window and did not think about ships or brothers or contracts. He thought about a gray hood coming down and a plain, steady face beneath it, and a voice that had said, "You've made a mistake in your arithmetic," into a room that had spent the whole evening making a mistake about her. He thought, I have made a mistake in my arithmetic. He thought, I have brought something into this house I do not understand. And Nathaniel Ashcroft, who had not been surprised by another human being in longer than he could remember, discovered that he did not entirely mind. He would not have called it hope. He'd have denied the word if you'd said it to his face. But he stood at that window far longer than a man settles a ship's contract, and when he finally turned away from the glass, there was a folded scrap of paper still in his coat. The argument he'd been losing all evening, and for the first time, it did not feel quite so much like losing. Somewhere in the house, a plain-faced girl was reading a thief's careful lies by candlelight and finding in every dishonest line the exact place where he would fall. She turned a page. She smiled. And she began very quietly to write. The papers Mrs. Doyle brought her were worse than Eleanor had feared, and better than she'd dared hope. Worse, because the marriage terms Calvin Reed had drafted that evening were a cage dressed as a courtesy. Better, because a man who builds a cage always leaves his fingerprints on the bars. She read them twice by candlelight before she found it. Clause the 9th. Buried between a paragraph about the disposition of the wife's dowry and a paragraph about the succession of any heir in language so dry, it was designed to make the eye slide right past. In the event that the estate of Silas Whitmore shall be found insolvent at the time of the marriage's consummation, all outstanding obligations thereof shall transfer in full to the household of Ashcroft, to be administered at the discretion of the estate's appointed solicitor. Eleanor read it a third time. Then she set down the paper and pressed her fingertips to her eyes. At the discretion of the estate's appointed solicitor. Not the Duke, the solicitor. Reed had written himself the right to swallow her father's entire debt into the Ashcroft household the moment she said her vows, and then to administer it himself alone unwatched. He would move it from one ledger to another, and it would vanish in the crossing. the way the grocer's bills vanished, the way the timber vanished, and Silas Whitmore's house would be gone, and the Duke would never know it had passed through anyone's hands at all. Because who reads Clause the Ninth? A grateful, quiet, invisible wife doesn't. That was the whole design. "You clever, greedy man," Eleanor murmured to the empty room. "You built the trap around the wrong girl." She copied the clause word for word into her own ledger in her small, precise hand. She noted the two places where Reed's phrasing in the marriage terms matched exactly the phrasing in the forged loan agreement that had killed her father's finances, the same fondness for the word thereof, the same trick of hiding the important clause between two dull ones. A forger has a voice the same as a writer. Reed's voice was all over both documents. She had him now in ink in his own hand twice. She had Mrs. Doyle return the papers before the sky grayed, and when the housekeeper asked at the door whether she'd found what she was looking for, Eleanor said only, "I found enough to be dangerous. Go to bed, Mrs. Doyle, and whatever happens tomorrow, you are never in this room." She did not sleep. There was no point pretending she would. Morning came hot and bright, the kind of thick July morning that made the whole valley smell of cut hay, and a maid Eleanor didn't know brought her a breakfast she didn't eat, and told her. His Grace would receive her in the West office at 9. Not asked. Told. Eleanor thanked the girl anyway because the girl had done nothing wrong, and then she dressed in the same plain gray she'd worn the night before deliberately, because she wanted Reed to look at her and see the ugly one, the quiet one, the one who'd do, and she took up her ledger and went to war. The West office was small and shut tight against the heat, and there were 3 people in it when she arrived. The Duke stood by the window with his back half turned, exactly as he'd stood the night before, which told her something about the man that he faced away from rooms he distrusted so he could watch them in the glass. Mrs. Doyle was not present. Eleanor had made certain of that, sending word through the maid that the housekeeper's morning was better spent elsewhere. And by the desk, arranging papers with the soft, unhurried motions of a man who has never once in his life been in a hurry, stood Calvin Reed. He was younger than she'd expected. That was her first surprise. She'd built a picture of a thief in her mind over 4 sleepless nights, and the picture had been gray and stooped and furtive. And Calvin Reed was none of those things. He was perhaps 40, smooth-faced, well-kept, with kind eyes, and a warm, unhurried smile, and the particular gentleness of manner that men learn when they've discovered gentleness disarms people faster than force ever could. He was, Eleanor understood in a single glance, very good at his work, far better than she'd been braced for. "Miss Whitmore?" Reed came around the desk before the Duke could speak, and he took her free hand in both of his, and his hands were warm and dry and steady. "May I say what a genuine pleasure it is? His Grace has told me of last evening. Your spirit. It's rare. It's truly rare. I hope you'll forgive an old solicitor's saying so, but this house has wanted a woman of substance for some years now." "Has it?" Eleanor said. "Oh, badly." He released her hand and gestured her to a chair with a warmth so complete it was almost real. "Please, sit. We've the marriage terms to review, and I confess I'm looking forward to it. It's not every day a man gets to draw papers for a bride who can read them." And there it was, the first move made so gently she'd have missed it if she hadn't known to watch. A bride who can read them. He'd heard what she did in the hall. He was telling her sweetly that he knew she was clever, so that when she showed she was clever, it would seem she was living up to his generous estimate rather than exposing his ugly secret. He was trying to make her cleverness his gift instead of her weapon. He was good. He was very, very good. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Eleanor said, and sat and folded her hands on her ledger and smiled the small, grateful smile of a plain girl who has been unexpectedly praised. "I should like to read them. Every line. I hope that's not tiresome of me." "Not at all," Reed said warmly. "Take all the time you... There's no need to read every line." The Duke's voice from the window. He had not turned around. "The terms are standard. Reed's drawn 100 of them. Sign, and we'll have the thing done before I sail Thursday." Eleanor looked at his back. Here was the second surprise of the morning, and it landed harder than the first. The Duke wanted this over. He wanted her signed and settled, and out of his sight exactly as he'd said in the hall, and he was going to hand her unknowingly impatiently straight into Reed's clause the ninth, because he trusted his solicitor of a dozen years and did not trust the plain-faced stranger he'd bought last night. Every instinct the Duke had was pointed the wrong way. He'd feel the wrongness in his house, and never once suspect it wore a kind face and warm, dry hands. She could have shown him the clause right then. She had it copied. She had the forgery matched. She could have laid it all on the desk and let it burn. She didn't. Because a thief this good would have a second knife, and Eleanor had learned long ago that you don't corner a clever man before you've found all his knives. Show Reed the one clause, and he'd smile and apologize and call it an oversight and quietly fix it, and then he'd know she could read past her own name, and he'd never again write anything down where she could reach it. Her whole power was that he thought her small. She would not spend it on a single clause. So instead she said mildly, "Of course, Your Grace. I'm sure the terms are perfectly standard. I only thought, since I'll be administering this household, I ought to understand how it's run. It seems a poor sort of wife who signs papers she hasn't read. But if you're in a hurry—" "Administering the household," the Duke repeated. Now he turned. "I said nothing about administering the household. You said produce an heir and stay out of your ledgers," Eleanor agreed. "I remember the terms. I'm not proposing to touch your ledgers. Your Grace, I'm proposing to run your house, the kitchens, the accounts of the kitchens, the staff, the 10,000 small daily costs that a duke shouldn't have to think about and generally doesn't. That's a wife's work. It's not your ledgers. It's the part of the estate too small for you to bother with." She let that sit one beat. "Unless you'd rather your household accounts stay wherever they are now, in whoever's hands they're in now." The room changed temperature. It was very slight. Reed's smile did not move, but his hands, which had been arranging papers, went still. The Duke did not notice. He was looking at Eleanor. "The household accounts are handled." "By whom?" "By Reed, as they've always been." "Ah." Eleanor nodded, pleasant, unbothered. "Then I'm sure they're in excellent order and I needn't trouble myself. Forgive me. It's only that at Whitmore I always kept the house accounts myself, and it's a hard habit to set down. I meant no slight to Mr. Reed." "None taken, none in the world," Reed said, and the warmth flooded back into his voice so fast it was almost seamless. Almost. "And do you know, Your Grace, there's real sense in what Miss Whitmore says. I've long thought the household accounts a poor use of my hours. All those grocer's bills, the endless small sums. A solicitor's time is better spent on your contracts, your loans, the matters of consequence. If Miss Whitmore has a taste for the small work." A fond, gentle smile in her direction. "Why, I'd be glad to be rid of it. It would free me for your real affairs." "Your Grace." And Eleanor thought, there it is, your second knife. Because she'd offered to take the household accounts, and any innocent man in Reed's position would have kept them. They were his. He understood them. No honest solicitor. Hands off 2 years of work to a stranger on her first morning. But Reed had offered them up. Gladly. Instantly. Which meant the household accounts were exactly the ledgers with the rot in them, and Reed would far rather hand her a bloated doctored book she'd have to untangle from scratch than let her anywhere near the loan agreements, the contracts, the place where the real forgeries lived. He was giving her the small theft to protect the large one. He was steering her sweetly toward the wrong ledger and calling it a kindness. He'd have gotten away with it too. Against almost any woman alive, he'd have gotten away with it. But Eleanor had already read the household accounts. Mrs. Doyle's swollen grocer's bills lived in her own memory now, 3 times the food that reached the kitchen. And she had already read the loan agreements, because they were the ones that had killed her father. And she knew, in a way, Reed could not possibly know. She knew that both books were written in the same dishonest hand. He thought he was handing her the smaller crime. He didn't understand that to Eleanor, the 2 crimes were the same crime because they were the same man. "That's very generous, Mr. Reed," she said. "I accept gladly. It'll give me something to do with my days, and heaven knows a contract wife needs something to do with her days." A flicker of something that might have been self-mockery, the plain girl, the useful girl, finding her little chores. "I'll want the household books this afternoon then, if it's no trouble. All of them. 2 years back so I can see the shape of what I'm inheriting. 2 years. A hairline crack in Reed's warmth. That's Miss Whitmore. That's a great many volumes. You needn't burden yourself with the old accounts. The current year's more than enough to acquaint you with. Oh, I'd hate to inherit a house without knowing its history. Eleanor smiled at him wide and guileless. My father always said you can't understand a ledger by its last page. You have to read where the money came from before you can trust where it's going. 2 years, Mr. Reed, if it's no trouble. And Calvin Reed, trapped between refusing a reasonable request from the future mistress of the house in front of the Duke, which would look strange, which would raise the very question he most needed to keep buried, and handing over 2 years of doctored accounts to a plain girl. He was 95% certain couldn't truly read them, made the only move his kind face allowed him. Of course, he said. This afternoon, 2 years. Thank you. Eleanor turned to the Duke, brisk and light. There. That's settled, and it cost you nothing. Your Grace, and it's freed your solicitor for your real affairs, which I understand are pressing. Shall we read the marriage terms now? I promise not to be tiresome about it. I only want to know what I'm signing. The Duke was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. She'd steered the entire conversation she and Reed both had. In fact, each thinking they were steering the other, and the Duke had felt the currents moving under the surface without being able to see them, and it plainly unsettled him. He was a man used to being the coldest, cleverest person in any room. He had walked into this office certain of it. He was no longer certain. Read them, he said slowly. If you must. So Eleanor read them. She read them slowly out loud, in the flat, careful voice of a girl sounding out words above her station, and she watched Reed relax by degrees as she did, because the voice told him what he wanted to hear, that she was reading the way a clever, but simple person reads plodding literal, missing the joins. She read the dowry clause. She read the succession clause. She read the paragraph about the heir. And when she reached clause the 9th, the cage, the trap at the discretion of the estate's appointed solicitor, she read it in exactly the same plodding voice without a flicker, without a pause, and she looked up at Reed with a small frown of confusion that she had practiced in the dark before dawn until it was perfect. I don't understand this one, she said. Clause the 9th. It's very tangled. Mr. Reed, would you explain it? I don't want to sign what I can't follow. And Reed, relieved, expansive, certain, now that the plain girl had reached the edge of her understanding exactly where he'd built the edge to be, leaned forward with his warmest, kindest smile and explained it to her. He explained it beautifully. He explained that it was a protection for her, that in the sad event, her father's estate proved insolvent. This clause ensured the debts wouldn't fall on her. Personally. Wouldn't shame her. Wouldn't follow her into her marriage. That instead, they'd be gently absorbed into the great strong household of Ashcroft and managed quietly, discreetly by the estate's own trusted solicitor, so that no scandal ever touched her name. He made the cage sound like an umbrella held over her in the rain. He was so kind about it, so gentle, so plainly on her side, that Eleanor understood exactly how he'd stolen for 2 years without a single soul suspecting. You didn't suspect Calvin Reed. You thanked him. Oh, Eleanor said softly when he'd finished. Oh, I see. So it protects me from the shame of it. Precisely, my dear. That's kinder than I expected. She let her voice go a little thick, a little wet. The grateful plain girl, overwhelmed by an unexpected mercy. I've spent so long being frightened of those debts, Mr. Reed, watching them grow, watching what they've done to my father. And you're telling me that the moment I sign this, they simply go away. They stop being mine. They stop being his. They pass to the household, yes, to be administered. By you. By me. Eleanor looked down at the paper. She let a long silence gather. She let Reed sit in his warmth and his certainty and his fond, gentle victory. And then she looked up, and the grateful thickness was gone from her voice, and her gray eyes were perfectly dry and perfectly steady, and she said, "Then why does the loan agreement say the debt compounds every season?" The office went silent. Because, She went on in the flat, plain voice she'd used to read the clause, only now there was steel running all the way through it. If this clause protects me, Mr. Reed, if it makes my father's debt go quietly away the moment I sign, then it doesn't much matter how fast that debt grows, does it? A debt that's about to vanish can grow as fast as it likes. It's forgiven either way. She turned a page in her own ledger unhurried. Unless the debt isn't meant to vanish, unless it's meant to transfer, at full value, swollen as fast as 4 times a year interest can swell it to whoever administers it. And then the person administering it, protecting me so kindly from the shame of it, carries that whole enormous sum onto the Ashcroft books, where it disappears into a household that loses money in every account it touches. My father's debt doesn't die when I sign this, Mr. Reed. It gets harvested, and I sign the scythe. Reed's warm face had not changed. That was the frightening thing about him, the thing Eleanor would remember. Even now caught his expression held. Miss Whitmore, I think I've read the household accounts, Eleanor said. The ones you so kindly gave me this morning before you'd given me anything at all. I think I've read the grocer's bills that come in at 3 times the food that reaches the kitchen. I think I've read the loan agreement that killed my father's finances, and I think I've read this marriage contract, and I think the same hand wrote all 3, because the same hand loves the word thereof, and hides the important clause between 2 dull ones every single time. She closed her ledger. You have a voice, Mr. Reed, on paper. Everyone who writes does, and yours is all over everything you've stolen, Your Grace. Reed turned to the Duke, and his voice was smooth and sorrowful, and utterly unruffled, and it was, Eleanor had to admit, a masterful performance. I did warn you. A woman scorned in front of the whole county brought into your house on a contract she resents. Of course she'll look for a villain. Of course she'll fasten on the man who drew the papers. It's the oldest story there is. I've served this family for 12 years. I'd ask you to consider which of us you've known one night and which you've known 12 years, the Duke said. He had gone very still by the window. 12 years, Reed. Yes, I was just thinking that. His voice was quiet and terrible, and Eleanor understood that she'd been wrong about the coldest man in the room, that the Duke's coldness had never been the absence of feeling, but a lid clamped down over a great deal of it. I was thinking that for 12 years I've had a wrongness in this house I couldn't name. A wrongness that made me colder every year and more tired and more certain that people were things to be managed rather than known. Because every time I trusted, I bled money I couldn't account for, and I decided the fault was in trusting. I decided the fault was in me for expecting people to be honest. He took a step toward the desk. And you let me decide that. For 12 years you watched me turn to ice, and you knew exactly why I was freezing, and you said nothing, because a cold and lonely man asks fewer questions than a warm one. I made myself unbearable to live with Reed, and you fed it, because it kept your ledgers safe. Your Grace, this is madness. The girl has... The girl, the Duke said, read a contract you were certain she couldn't read, and found in one morning what I couldn't find in 12 years. And the reason I couldn't find it is that I trusted the wrong person and doubted everyone else, which is a lesson I appear to have needed a stranger in a gray hood to teach me. He was at the desk now. He put one hand flat on the marriage terms. Show me the loan agreement, Miss Whitmore, the one that compounds by the season. Show me your father's. It's not here. It's at Whitmore in my father's strongbox, but I copied the clause word for word. Eleanor opened her ledger to the page. And I copied this clause. Here. Read them side by side, Your Grace. Read them out loud if you like. Tell me if they're written by the same hand or not, and then decide which of us you've known one night and which you've known 12 years, because one of us just tried to make you sign away a dying man's house, and it wasn't the stranger. The Duke read them. He read them side by side in silence, and Eleanor watched his face, and saw the exact moment the 12 years rearranged themselves, saw every cold decision he'd ever made about the untrustworthiness of human beings tip over and reveal a different shape entirely. He hadn't grown cold because people were false. He'd grown cold because one person was false, and he'd trusted that one above all the true ones. The coldness had been a mistake from the very first winter of it. And he was only now at 32 finding that out from a woman he'd called ugly to her face 12 hours before. "Same hand," he said at last, very quietly. "The same. Thereof. The claws hidden between two dull ones. It's the same man." He looked up at Reed, and his face was not cold anymore. It was worse than cold. "It's you." "Your Grace." "Don't." The Duke's voice cracked across the small room. "Don't you dare stand in my house and your Grace me in that voice. That voice is how you did it. That gentle, reasonable, devoted voice, you've been using it on me for 12 years, and I bought every word, and it made me the kind of man who could walk into a hall last night and call a woman ugly to a room full of strangers because you taught me one theft at a time that no one was worth being kind to." He was breathing hard. "You didn't just steal my money, Reed. You made me into this. Cold, cruel, alone. You needed me lonely, so I'd ask no questions, and you made me lonely, and I've spent 12 years thinking that was simply my nature." For the first time, something moved behind Calvin Reed's kind eyes. Not guilt. Eleanor watched closely and saw it clearly, and it was not guilt. It was calculation. The warm mask had finally slipped, and what was underneath was not a broken man caught in his sin. It was a cornered animal, deciding fast and cold which way to run. "You've no proof," Reed said, and his voice had changed too, the warmth draining out of it, leaving something flat and quick behind. "A copied clause in a girl's private book. A loan agreement 40 miles away in a dying man's strongbox that I'd wager you've had ample chance to forge yourself, you clever little thing. Match the hands, I'll bring you 6 clerks who'll swear the hands don't match, and you'll bring your what? Your housekeeper." His eyes cut to the side and Eleanor's stomach dropped because she saw that he knew. "Oh yes, I know Mrs. Doyle carried papers to the East Wing last night. I know a great deal about this house, Miss Whitmore. That's rather been my whole point. You've one night in it. I've 12 years. And in 12 years, a man learns exactly how much rope everyone in a house has, and exactly where they'd hang if it came to it." He straightened his cuffs. "You've made a very serious accusation with nothing but ink to back it. Ink you wrote yourself. Think carefully about what happens next. To you, to your poor housekeeper, to your dying father whose strongbox I could reach in a day." The threat landed in the room like a dropped stone, and Eleanor felt fear, then real fear, cold and specific, because he was right about all of it. Copied ink, a frightened housekeeper, a father 40 miles away who couldn't defend himself. Reed had spent 12 years learning where every soul in this house would break, and he'd just named all of hers in a single breath, and he'd done it in front of the Duke to show her he wasn't afraid of the Duke, which meant he had something on the Duke too, something that made him feel safe, and Eleanor didn't know what it was, and not knowing was the most dangerous place she'd stood all night. She had walked into this office with a copied clause and a matched forgery, and she had thought that was enough. It wasn't enough. Against Calvin Reed, it was nowhere near enough. "You're right," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. "You're right that copied ink proves nothing. You're right that you could bring 6 clerks to swear the hands don't match. You're right that I've been in this house one night and you've been in it 12 years, and you know exactly where everyone would break." She stood slowly and gathered her ledger to her chest, and she was pleased to find her hands were steady even now. "You've thought of everything, Mr. Reed. You've thought of it for 12 years. I've had one night." She looked at him. "Which is why I didn't bring you the loan agreement this morning, and why I didn't bring you the household accounts, though you handed them to me so kindly. I brought you neither because I knew you'd have an answer ready for any single piece of paper I put on this desk. You always have an answer ready. That's your whole craft." "Then you've nothing," Reed said. "As I said. I've a question." Eleanor tilted her head. "Just one. You said the debt would transfer to the household to be administered at the discretion of the estate's appointed solicitor. Those are your words. You wrote them. You read them aloud to me not 10 minutes ago and called them a protection." She paused. "Mr. Reed, who appointed you—" Silence. "The estate's appointed solicitor," Eleanor said again slowly, turning the phrase over like a coin. Appointed by whom? Because his grace has just told me and told you that he inherited you along with the house. He didn't appoint you. His father did, or his grandfather. You wrote a clause giving vast unwatched power to the estate's appointed solicitor. But there's no document appointing you, is there? There's no contract of your employment on file, no terms, no authority in writing. You've held this position for 12 years on nobody's signature but your own good name. I looked. It was the one thing I could look for in a single night without touching a ledger you'd have an answer for. She let it land. You wrote yourself power in a marriage contract that you don't legally hold anywhere else. And the moment His Grace's lawyer in Boston asks to see the papers appointing you, the papers that must exist, if that clause means anything, there won't be any. Because you were never appointed, you simply stayed. And no one ever asked because you were so very kind about it. Reed's face had finally fully changed. The kind eyes were gone. What sat behind them was old and cold and afraid, and Eleanor understood she'd found the one thing he had no answer for, because it was the one thing he'd built his whole quiet empire on top of that. No one had ever in 12 years asked to see his authority in writing. He'd made himself indispensable and unquestioned. He'd never dreamed he'd need proof of a thing everyone simply assumed. Your Grace, Eleanor said without looking away from Reed. I'd send to Boston today. To your own lawyer, not this one. Ask him for the document appointing Calvin Reed solicitor to this estate with its date and its terms. If it exists, I'm a scorned woman fastening on a villain, and you should throw me out of your house and be glad of it. But if it doesn't exist, if a man's administered your loans and your contracts and your entire fortune for 12 years on nobody's authority but his own, then you'll want to know that today. Before you sail Thursday. Before you leave him alone with everything you own. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Reed lunged for the ledger in her hands. It was fast and ugly, and entirely without warning. The kind, gentle solicitor gone in an instant. And if Eleanor had been standing where he expected her to stand, he'd have had it. But she'd been watching his hands since the moment his warmth first cracked. Watching them the way she watched everything. And she stepped back and turned her shoulder, and the ledger stayed hers. And the Duke moved. He crossed the smaller room faster than Eleanor would have believed a man his size could move, and he put himself between Reed and Eleanor, and he took a fistful of the solicitor's fine coat, and for one white instant the whole cold edifice of Nathaniel Ashcroft cracked wide open, and there was nothing behind it but fury. You put your hand toward her, the Duke said very low, in my house, one night after I brought her here. Give me one reason, Reed, one reason not to. Your Grace, please. The kind voice again. The Duke's hand tightened. 12 years. Don't. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it stopped the Duke's hand as surely as if she'd grabbed his wrist. Don't hurt him. He reached for you. He reached for a book. Let him have wanted it. Don't put a bruise on him, Your Grace, because a bruise is the only thing in this room that could turn him from a thief into a victim, and he knows it, and half the reason he lunged was to make you do exactly this. She met Reed's eyes over the Duke's shoulder, and she saw in the cornered flat cold of them that she was right. He'd love a bruise. He'd wear it to a magistrate. Let him go. Slowly the Duke's hand opened. Reed staggered back, straightening his coat, and something like a smile ghosted across his face. A small, ugly, admiring thing, the smile of one predator, acknowledging another. You, he said to Eleanor, are the single most dangerous person to ever walk into this house, and they called you the plain one. He gave a short, breathless laugh. God, the waste of it. If you'd been born a man, you'd own the whole valley by now. He backed toward the door. Send to Boston, then, by all means. Ask your lawyer for my letter of appointment. Take your time about it. I find I've business elsewhere. You're not leaving this house, the Duke said. Am I not? Reed's hand found the door. On what charge? Your Grace? A copied clause. A missing letter. You've no magistrate in the room, and no proof in your hand. You've a clever girl's suspicions and a great deal of hurt pride, and by the time you've turned either into a warrant, I'll be a long way from Massachusetts. He inclined his head, and the awful gentle warmth flickered back over his face like a candle relit. And that was the most frightening thing of all, that he could put it back on at will. "It's been an honor serving the family. Miss Whitmore, do give my regards to your father, while he lasts." And he was gone. The Duke went after him 2 long strides toward the door, and Eleanor said, "Your Grace!" And something in her voice stopped him again. "He's leaving," the Duke said. "He robbed me for 12 years and threatened your father in my own office, and he's walking out the door, and you want me to—" "I want you to let him think he's won." The Duke turned. "What? He's right," Eleanor said. "That's the terrible thing you have to hear. Your Grace, and hear fast, because we've very little time. He's right. We have a copied clause and a missing letter and a great deal of hurt pride. And if you chase him down and drag him to a magistrate today, he walks free by tomorrow and spends the rest of his life somewhere we can't reach with everything he's already stolen, and my father's house still falls because the fall was always coming, and Reed running doesn't stop it." She set her ledger on the desk. "But a man who thinks he's won stops running. A man who thinks he's outsmarted the plain girl and the trusting Duke doesn't flee the county. He lingers. He comes back for the rest because there's always a rest. Your Grace, a man who steals for 12 years doesn't stop at what he's already got. He comes back to finish the harvest. And when he comes back for it, he'll have to touch the loan agreement, or the strongbox, or the Boston lawyer, or the one true document that proves everything, and that's when we take him. Not on my suspicions. On his own hand, reaching for the proof with witnesses of your choosing in the room." She looked at the Duke steadily. "You've been letting people manage you for 12 years, Your Grace. Reed managed you. The whole county managed you. Let me manage this one thing. Let him think he's won. And I promise you he'll walk back into this house on his own 2 feet and hand us the rope himself." The Duke stared at her, and Eleanor watched the last of the cold leave him, not all at once, not warmly, but the way ice goes off a window in July, thinning at the edges, letting the light through in pieces. "Last night," he said slowly, "I called you ugly in front of the whole county. You did. To your face, to my face, and a good many other things. No suitors, no influence, no beauty worth negotiating over. I remember all of it. I expect I'll remember it for the rest of my life." Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "You don't get to feel better about that yet, Your Grace. I'm not going to make it easy for you the way Reed made everything easy. That was his trick. Everything he did was easy and warm, and it cost you your whole self. I'm the opposite of Calvin Reed. Everything I do is going to cost you something true. And the first thing it costs you is this: you don't get forgiven for last night, just because I turned out to be useful this morning. Useful isn't the same as forgiven." For a moment the Duke said nothing, then very quietly, "No, I don't suppose it is." "Good." Eleanor picked up her ledger again, held it to her chest, that old protective gesture, the one she'd used in the hall while they laughed at her. "Then we understand each other. Send to Boston for the letter that doesn't exist. Say nothing to anyone about what happened in this room. Nothing to the staff. Nothing to the council. Nothing to Lady Vale if she comes sniffing, and she will. Let the whole county keep believing you've married the plain, quiet, harmless Whitmore girl who does sums to keep herself busy. It's the most useful thing about me, Your Grace. Everyone underestimates the plain one. Even you did. Especially you did." A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile. "I've spent 25 years being nobody's idea of a threat. I'm very good at it. Let me be good at it a little longer, and I'll hand you the man who stole your fortune and your kindness, both gift-wrapped with his own name on it." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he did the thing again. The small bow. The inch of inclined head, the concession of ground that this house had never seen him give before last night. "Manage it then, Miss Whitmore," he said. "It appears you're the only person I can trust to." "I'm the only person you can't manage," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing as trust, but it'll do to start." She turned toward the door, and then paused and looked back at him. and for just one moment, the steel went out of her voice, and something younger and more tired showed underneath the girl by the staircase, the one who'd counted their laughter. "For what it's worth, Your Grace. You were made cold. You weren't born it. I've watched a lot of people get made into things they weren't born to be. My father was made into a man who blames himself for a debt he never earned. I was made into a girl who hides her face so no one has to look at it. And you were made into a man who calls strangers ugly to feel less alone." She opened the door. The one mercy in all of it is that a thing that's been made can be unmade, if you want it badly enough, if you're willing to let it cost you something true. And she left him there in the small hot office with a marriage contract he could no longer sign, and 12 years of his life turned inside out on the desk, and the strangest feeling moving through his chest that he had not felt since he was a boy, before the money and the coldness and Calvin Reed's gentle managing voice. It took him a long moment to name it. It was the feeling of being seen, all the way down, by someone who had every reason to hate him and had looked anyway and had told him the truth. Nathaniel Ashcroft sat down slowly in the chair Eleanor had left and put his head in his hands, and for the first time in 12 years in the privacy of an empty room, the coldest man in the valley let himself feel the whole enormous weight of what had been done to him and what he had done to others, and how far he would have to travel to become a man worth the trust that a plain girl in a gray hood had just against all sense decided to lend him. Out in the corridor, walking fast toward the east wing with her ledger clutched to her chest, Eleanor Whitmore passed a window and caught without meaning to her own reflection in the glass. Plain gray, unremarkable, the face a whole county had laughed at the night before. She stopped. She looked at it a moment, and then she thought of Reed's flat, cold eyes, and his gentle voice, and his threat against her father 40 miles away in a strongbox he could reach in a day. And she understood that the game had only just begun, and that she'd made an enemy far cleverer and far crueler than the cold duke she'd come here to outwit, an enemy who now knew exactly what she was and would never again make the mistake of thinking her plain. For the first time, she wondered if she'd moved too fast, if she'd shown too much, if a wiser woman would have kept the hood up one more day. Then she thought of her father's hands that couldn't hold a pen and the strength he'd found to grip her wrist and say for the family. And she kept walking. She kept walking, and she did not stop walking for 11 days, because that was how long it took the letter to reach Boston and come back, and 11 days was a very long time to live in a house with a thief who thought he'd won. Reed didn't flee the county. Eleanor had been right about that, and being right gave her no comfort at all. He didn't flee because he didn't need to. He came to the wedding because there was a wedding. There had to be. The whole county had watched the Duke choose the plain Whitmore girl, and the whole county was waiting to watch him regret it. And a Duke who canceled a marriage 11 days after announcing it would set every tongue in Massachusetts wagging about why, and the why was the one thing Eleanor and the Duke could not afford to have wagged about. So the wedding went forward. It went forward small and cold and quick in the front room of Ashcroft Hall on a Thursday morning, with a Boston minister and a dozen witnesses, and Calvin Reed standing among them in his good gray coat, smiling his warm and gentle smile, because a solicitor of 12 years standing could hardly be kept away from the master's wedding without questions. Eleanor married the Duke with Reed watching, and she felt his eyes on the back of her neck through the whole of it, and she said her vows in the plain flat voice of a plain flat girl. And she did not once look at the solicitor, because looking at him would have told him she was afraid. She was afraid. She'd been afraid for 11 days. "You may kiss the bride," the minister said. And there was a small, terrible silence in the room because nobody, least of all the bride and groom, had thought about this part. The Duke looked at her. Eleanor looked back at him, and in her eyes was a message she trusted him by now to read, not for them. Don't you dare make this real for them. And the Duke, who 11 days ago would have brushed his lips against her cheek with all the warmth of a man signing a receipt, because that was the coldest, safest, most managed thing to do, leaned in, and instead of her cheek, he pressed his mouth to her forehead gently, the way you'd bless someone, the way you'd promise something without words, and he murmured so low that only she could hear it beneath the rustle of the witnesses. 11 days. Then we take him. Hold on." And Eleanor, who had held her father's dying hands, and her family's dying fortune, and her own dignity, through a whole county's laughter, felt her throat close unexpectedly at 3 quiet words from a man she was supposed to be managing. "Hold on." She held on. The letter from Boston arrived that same afternoon, an hour after the last wedding guest had gone, carried up the drive by a rider the Duke had paid to gallop the last 20 miles. Eleanor and the Duke read it together in the West office with the door shut. And it said exactly what Eleanor had promised it would say, and feared it wouldn't. The Duke's Boston lawyer, a careful old man named Prentice, had searched the estate's founding papers, and the county records, and his own firm's archives, and he could find no letter, no contract, no instrument of any kind appointing Calvin Reed solicitor to the Ashcroft estate. There was no record of his hiring. There was no record of his authority. There was, as far as the law of Massachusetts was concerned, no reason on earth that Calvin Reed should have been touching the Ashcroft ledgers at all. He'd simply walked into the house 12 years ago, in the confusion after the old Duke's death, when Nathaniel was 19, and grieving, and glad to hand the tedious business of the estate to any competent gentleman who offered, and he had never left, and no one had ever asked. 12 years, the Duke said again. He'd said it 100 times in 11 days. He said it now with a kind of wonder, turning the lawyer's letter in his hands. "He forged a loan for your father. He swelled my accounts. He drew every contract this estate has signed since I was 19, and he did all of it with no more right than a man off the street." "With exactly the right of a man off the street," Eleanor said. "That's the whole trick of it, Your Grace. Authority isn't a thing you have. It's a thing people agree you have. Reed understood that better than any man I've ever read about. He never needed a letter. He needed everyone to be too polite or too grieved or too trusting to ask for one." She set the lawyer's letter flat on the desk. "And now we have a letter that says no letter exists. Which is the only weapon that's ever going to bring him down, because it doesn't depend on my ink, or Mrs. Doyle's word, or my father's strongbox. It depends on an absence. And there is no clerk in the world he can bribe to swear that an absence isn't absent." The Duke looked at her. "Then we have him." "No," Eleanor said. "We have half of him." "Eleanor!" It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss. He seemed to notice it as it left his mouth and let it stand. "Prentice says there's no appointment. That's fraud. That's theft. That's 12 years of touching money he'd no right to touch. What more do we have proof he had no authority," Eleanor said. "We don't have proof he stole. Do you see the difference? It's the whole difference. Your Grace and Reed will live or hang in the gap between the two." She began to pace the small office ledger in hand, the way she paced when her mind was moving faster than her mouth. A magistrate looks at Prentice's letter and says, "Very well, the man had no letter of appointment. That's irregular. That's careless shame on the old Duke for not filing one." But Reed stands up in his good gray coat, with his warm and gentle voice, and says, "Your Honor, I served this family loyally for 12 years. I was as good as appointed. Everyone knew my role. I simply never troubled anyone to put it on paper. And half the county will nod, because half the county liked him, because he was kind to all of them, because kindness is the best disguise a thief ever wore. The missing letter makes him irregular. It doesn't make him a criminal. For that we need to catch his hand in the theft, in the act. Reaching for money he knows isn't his in front of witnesses who can't be bought." She stopped pacing. "Which means we need him to reach. And a man who thinks he's beaten doesn't reach." "So we've spent 11 days, the Duke said slowly, "letting him believe he's beaten. And now you want him to believe he's winning again, so that he'll reach. Now you're thinking like me." Eleanor almost smiled. "It's an unpleasant feeling, isn't it? I've had it my whole life." The problem was Margaret Vale. Eleanor had known Margaret Vale would come. She'd said as much to the Duke in the West office. She'll come sniffing, and she will. But she had underestimated when, and she had catastrophically underestimated why. She had thought Margaret would come to gloat, to needle the plain bride to reassure herself that the woman who'd stolen her Duke was as unworthy as she needed her to be. That was the Margaret she'd read in the grand hall, beautiful, spoiled, cruel, in the small, vain way of a woman who's never been told no. That was not the Margaret who arrived at Ashcroft Hall 3 days after the wedding. "Her Grace the Duchess is not receiving," the new footman told the Lady Vale at the door, using the title stiffly because the staff were all still adjusting to the fact that the plain Whitmore girl was now the mistress of the house. "Her Grace will receive me," Margaret said, "or Her Grace will read about her husband's solicitor in every drawing room in Boston by Sunday. Tell her I said that, word for word." Eleanor received her. She received her in the small east sitting room, alone with her ledger, nowhere in sight, dressed once more in the plain gray that made people forget to be careful around her. And Margaret Vale swept in radiant and furious and afraid. Eleanor saw the fear at once, under the radiance, the way she saw everything, and sat without being asked, and looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and then said something Eleanor had not braced for at all. "He's going to kill you," Margaret said. "Read. He's going to kill you, and you don't even know enough to be frightened, which is why I've come. God help me, because I cannot watch another woman walk into that man's teeth without at least warning her." Eleanor went very still. "Another woman," she said. "My sister," Margaret said, and her beautiful face broke just slightly, and behind the break was something Eleanor recognized because she'd worn it herself for 2 years old grief carried alone, dressed up as something harder, so no one would ask about it. "My older sister, Cornelia. You won't have heard of her. No one speaks of her. She was to marry into a family Reed had his hooks in 5 years ago. A family with debts like your father's debts that Reed was administering." Margaret's mouth twisted around the gentle word. "Cornelia was clever. Cleverer than me. Far cleverer. Everyone always said so. The clever Vale girl and the pretty one, and I was the pretty one, and I hated her for it. And God forgive me, I'd give my whole face to have her back. She found something in the family's accounts. She wrote to me about it, a letter giddy proud. She'd found some irregularity, she was going to expose it. She was going to be the heroine of the whole affair." Margaret's voice had gone flat and terrible. She drowned 3 days later. In a mill pond she'd swum in since she was 6 years old on a calm summer evening, a strong swimmer alone. They called it an accident. Everyone called it an accident. I was 17. I believed them because believing them was easier than the other thing. She looked up, and her eyes were dry now, dry and hard and certain. "I stopped believing them the night I watched Reed smile at your wedding. That smile. He smiled that exact smile at Cornelia's funeral. I've spent 5 years telling myself I imagined it. I didn't imagine it. He killed my sister for finding what you've found, and he'll kill you too, and he'll do it gently, and everyone will call it an accident, and in 5 years, someone will finally warn the next clever girl, and on it goes." The room was very quiet, and Eleanor felt the whole shape of the thing she was fighting shift and grow, becoming larger and older and far more monstrous than a man who padded grocer's bills, and she understood with a coldness that started in her stomach and spread outward that she had spent 11 days thinking she was hunting a thief. She was hunting a murderer. "You're certain," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Margaret, look at me. You're certain, and not grieving, not needing it to be someone's fault. Because those are different things, and I have to know which one you are before I have her letter," Margaret said. Eleanor stopped breathing. "Cornelia's letter, the one about the irregularity. I kept it for 5 years in a box I never opened, because opening it meant deciding it was murder, and deciding it was murder meant I'd have to do something, and I was too much of a coward." Margaret reached into her reticule and drew out a folded paper gone soft and gray at the creases from 5 years of not being touched. It names the family, it names the debt, and it names the man administering it in Cornelia's own hand 3 days before she drowned. I've read it 1,000 times without ever reading it, if you understand me. I could recite it and never hear a word. But you, she held it out, and her hand was shaking. You'll hear it. You're the kind who hears things. Take it. Do the thing I was too much of a coward to do. And for God's sake, be more careful than she was, because Cornelia thought being clever was enough, and it wasn't. It got her killed. And you're cleverer than Cornelia, and it'll get you killed faster." Eleanor took the letter. She did not open it yet. She held it, and she looked at Margaret Vale, the beautiful, cruel woman who'd hissed girls like, "You don't get to keep things over her shoulder at the wedding." And she saw all the way to the bottom of her, the way she saw everyone. And what was at the bottom was not cruelty. It was 5 years of unopened grief, and a sister at the bottom of a mill pond, and a guilt so heavy it had bent a whole life crooked. "You weren't a coward," Eleanor said quietly. "I watched him for 5 years and did nothing. You were 17. You were 17 and terrified and grieving, and everyone around you was calling it an accident. And you had one letter in a box and no power. And no one who'd have believed you, and a man who'd already shown you what happens to Vale girls who find things. That's not cowardice, Margaret. That's survival. I've told a housekeeper the very same thing in this house 11 days ago, and I'll tell you now, there's no shame in surviving. The shame belongs to Reed. All of it. Every ounce. You've carried a portion of it for 5 years that was never yours to carry, and you can set it down now because you've done the brave thing. You've come to the one person in this county who can use what you know." She looked down at the soft gray letter in her hands. "And I will use it. I promise you that. I'll use it so well that Cornelia's name is the thing that hangs him." Margaret Vale, who had walked into that room, armored in radiance and fury, put her beautiful face in her hands and wept, and Eleanor let her, and did not do the reflective listening thing that would have made it worse, only sat with her quiet until the storm passed. And when it passed, Eleanor had an ally she'd never have chosen, and a murder she'd never suspected, and a letter that changed everything. Because Cornelia Vale's letter, when Eleanor finally opened it that night alone, by candlelight in the east wing, with the door locked and her own ledger open beside it, did not just name Reed. It named his method. Cornelia had been cleverer than Margaret knew. In the giddy, proud, doomed letter to her sister, she'd written out exactly what she'd found, the way a clever girl writes when she thinks she's about to be a heroine and wants a record of her own brilliance. And what she'd found 5 years ago, in a different family's accounts, was the same clause. Word for word. To be administered at the discretion of the estate's appointed solicitor. The same trick with the debt transferring on a marriage. The same fondness for thereof. The same hidden ninth clause between two dull ones. Reed hadn't invented the scheme for Eleanor's father. He'd run it before. He'd run it for years. Family by family, debt by debt, marriage by marriage. Finding houses in trouble, worming his way into their papers, forging the terms, and harvesting the whole debt into whatever larger estate he'd attached himself to, pocketing the difference in the crossing. He'd done it to the Vale's intended in-laws. He'd done it to God knew how many others. And every time a clever girl came close to finding it, there was a mill pond, or a fall down a staircase, or a fever that came on sudden, and everyone called it an accident, because Calvin Reed was so gentle, so kind, so grieved at the funeral. Eleanor sat with that for a long time in the candlelight. Then she did something she had not done since she was a child. She got up and she walked the length of the east wing, and she knocked on the door of the Duke's private study at midnight. And when he opened it, startled, half-dressed, a lamp in his hand, she said the thing she'd sworn to herself in the grand hall she would never say to any man again. "I'm frightened." The Duke set down the lamp. "Tell me," he said. And she told him. All of it. Margaret and Cornelia and the mill pond and the letter and the clause that was the same clause 5 years and 40 miles, and a drowned girl removed from her father's ruined house. She told him without softening it, in her flat, plain voice, that only cracked once on the word drowned, and the Duke listened without moving. And when she'd finished, he was no longer the man who'd called her ugly in the grand hall. He was something Eleanor hadn't seen in him before, and it took her a moment to recognize it, because she'd never seen him afraid for someone. "You're not going to catch him," the Duke said. "Not you. Not anymore. Your Grace, he killed a girl for finding what you've found. You said it yourself. He'll do it gently, and everyone will call it an accident." His voice was rough. "I brought you into this house. I called you ugly to a room full of strangers and bought you like a coin off a table and dropped you into the middle of a... I did that. And now you're telling me the man who's already killed once knows exactly what you are and exactly what you know, and you want to keep managing it, keep playing the plain, quiet girl who does sums while a murderer decides whether you're worth a millpond. He shook his head. No, I'll go to the magistrate tomorrow with Prentice's letter and Cornelia's letter and your ledger, and I'll let the law will do nothing, Eleanor said. You know it will do nothing. Margaret's had that letter for 5 years. A grieving sister's 5-year-old letter, and a missing appointment, and a bride's suspicions. Reed talks his way out of every piece of it in an afternoon, and then he knows we've moved, and then there's a millpond for me, and one for Margaret both, and Cornelia drowned for nothing all over again. She stepped closer. I hear you. Your Grace, I do. And it means more than you know that you'd rather protect me than catch him. 11 days ago, you'd have chosen catching him. You've changed, and I see it, and it matters. But you cannot protect me by acting, because acting is exactly what got Cornelia killed. The only thing that protects me is that Reed still doesn't know how much I know. He thinks I found the missing appointment. He doesn't know I have Cornelia's letter. He doesn't know I know about the millpond. As long as he thinks I'm one clever step behind him instead of 5 ahead, he won't reach for the millpond. He'll reach for the money because a man like Reed always believes he can win with money before he has to win with murder. My ignorance is my armor. If you go to the magistrate, you take my armor off. The Duke stared at her for a long moment. You'd use your own life as the bait, he said. Deliberately, knowingly, with a murderer. I'd use the appearance of my life, Eleanor said. There's a difference, and my whole plan lives in it. I want Reed to think I'm bait he can take safely. I want him to think the plain, quiet Duchess is right on the edge of exposing his theft, close enough to panic him, not close enough to have already won, so that he does the thing he did to your accounts, and your father's loan, and the Vales's in-laws, the thing that's easier and warmer and quieter than murder. I want him to reach for the money one last time, to move the harvest, to touch the one document that proves the theft in a place we've prepared in front of witnesses. He can't buy Prentice down from Boston, the magistrate himself, if we can manage at Margaret to swear to Cornelia's letter. She held his eyes. And the only way to make a murderer choose theft over murder is to make the theft look easy and the murder look unnecessary. Which means I have to look like a problem he can still solve with a pen, not a girl who already knows about the millpond. Do you see? The moment he thinks I know about Cornelia, the pen isn't enough anymore, and he reaches for the water instead. My safety and my ignorance are the same thing, Your Grace. Take away one and you take away the other. The Duke was quiet for a very long time. I hate it, he said finally. I hate every part of it. I hate that you're right. I hate that the cleverest thing to do with a woman that the cleverest thing is to leave her in the water and trust her to swim. He scrubbed a hand over his face. 11 days ago, I'd have agreed to this without a second thought, because 11 days ago, you were a coin off a table, and your life was a thing on my ledger, and I didn't have this. This thing that's making it so hard to say yes. Eleanor went still. What thing? She said very carefully. And the Duke, who had spent 12 years learning to say nothing true, who had been made cold by a gentle thief, and only just begun to thaw, looked at his plain gray wife in the midnight lamplight, and did the bravest thing. Eleanor had watched him do, braver than the near blow he'd almost struck Reed, braver than the forehead kiss at the wedding. The thing where I've started to be glad you're in this house, he said. Even like this. Even wrong, even cold, even bought. The thing where I lie awake down the hall, and know you're lying awake down yours, working, always working, and I feel less alone than I've felt since I was 19. The thing where the idea of a millpond with your name on it makes me want to burn Calvin Reed's whole world to the ground and hang the consequences. He said it plainly, without warmth, almost angrily, the only way a man that frozen could say a thing that hot. I don't know what to call it. I'm not fool enough to call it the thing the poets call it. You'd never forgive me, and you'd be right. We've known each other 12 days, and half of them I've spent being a monster. But it's something, Eleanor, and it's real. And it's the reason I can't say yes to your plan the way I'd have said yes 11 days ago. Because 11 days ago, your life was cheap to me. And it isn't anymore. And I needed you to know that before you walk yourself into that man's teeth. Eleanor did not answer for a moment. Then she said quietly, and there was a tremble in it she didn't try to hide, "That's the cruelest thing you could have told me tonight." "I know. Because now I have something to lose too." She looked down at her hands. "I've spent 25 years making sure I had nothing anyone could take. It's how I survived. You keep nothing precious where the world can reach it, and then the world can't hurt you. And I got so good at it, Your Grace. I got so good at wanting nothing, and now you've stood in a doorway at midnight and handed me a thing to lose 3 days after I married you for a house and a wall and a name." Her voice cracked. "I don't forgive you for the Grand Hall. I want that understood. This changes nothing about the Grand Hall." "I know," the Duke said again. "I'm not asking it to. But I heard you." She looked up and her eyes were wet and steady both. "I heard every word, and I'll carry it into that man's teeth, and it'll make me more careful, not less, because now I've a reason of my own to come back out. So thank you for handing me something to lose. It's a terrible gift, and I'll never be able to give it back, and I don't entirely wish you hadn't." A breath. "We'll do it my way. But you'll be closer than you want to be every step, and you'll trust me to swim, and when the moment comes when Reed reaches for the money, you'll be there, and Prentice will be there, and the magistrate, and Margaret, and we'll take him not for the theft alone, but for Cornelia, so that a girl who drowned 5 years ago finally gets to be the reason a monster hangs. Are we agreed?" The Duke crossed the space between them. He did not touch her. They were not there yet, and both of them knew it, and the not touching was its own kind of promise. But he stood close, closer than he'd stood to anyone in 12 years, and he said, "We're agreed. But Eleanor, if it goes wrong, if he reaches for the water instead of the pen, if I'm one room too far away." His voice dropped. "Promise me you'll scream. Not manage it, not outthink it. Scream and I'll come, and to hell with the plan. Promise me the plan comes second to you being alive." "I can't promise that." "Eleanor, I can't, because if I promise it, I'll believe it, and if I believe it, I'll take the easy way out. The first moment I'm frightened, and then the plan fails, and Reed walks, and it all comes to nothing, and there's a mill pond for Margaret next." She reached out the first time she'd touched him of her own will, and put her hand flat against his chest, not tender, steadying the way you'd steady something about to fall. "But I'll promise you this. I'll fight to come back out. Not because the plan wants it, because I do. Because you handed me a reason tonight, and I'm too selfish now to waste it. That's the most honest thing I have, Your Grace, and it's more than I've given anyone in years. So take it and let it be enough." The Duke put his hand over hers on his chest and held it there. "Nathaniel," he said, "if you're going to walk into a murderer's teeth wearing my name, you might use the front of it." "Nathaniel," Eleanor said. It sounded strange and enormous in her mouth. "All right, Nathaniel." And for one moment in the midnight lamplight, the plain girl and the cold Duke stood with her hand on his heart and his hand over hers. Two people who had been made into things they weren't born to be. Deciding silently, without the words the poets used to try to unmake it together if they lived. Then Eleanor stepped back because there was work to do, and the work would not wait for tenderness, and both of them understood that too. She went to work the next morning as the plain, quiet duchess who did sums. It was the finest performance of her life, and no one watched it but the man she was performing for. And he never knew he was the audience, which is the only kind of performance worth giving to a man like Reed. She let herself be seen frowning over the household accounts he'd handed her, the swollen grocer's bills, the doctored timber. She let it be known below stairs that the new duchess was ever so puzzled by some of the old numbers that she'd been asking questions. Careful questions, the questions of a woman getting close to something and not quite there. She fed the house exactly the story she needed the house to carry to Reed, because a house always carries stories to the man who's been kind to all of it, and Reed had been kind to all of it for 12 years. She let him think she was 5 days from the truth, not 5 steps ahead of it. And on the 9th day of the 11, Calvin Reed came back to Ashcroft Hall. He came in his good gray coat, warm and gentle, with a leather folio under his arm and a smile for every servant, and he asked so reasonably, so kindly for a private word with the new Duchess about the household accounts, which he understood had been troubling her, and which he'd be only too glad to help her understand one last time before he retired from the family service to make way for her ladyship's own excellent management. He was going to move the harvest. Eleanor knew it the moment she heard he'd asked for the accounts. He was going to sit her down warm and gentle and walk her through a reconciliation of the household books, and somewhere in that reconciliation, buried between 2 dull columns, he was going to have her sign or initial a transfer that swept the last of the stolen money clean out of reach into an account she'd never trace, all while explaining it to her as a kindness, a tidying, a favor. He was going to steal the last of it from under her nose and make her thank him exactly the way he'd made the Duke thank him for 12 years. He thought she was 5 days behind. He had no idea she was standing at the far edge of a trap she'd spent 9 days building with Prentice the lawyer already hidden in the next room, and the county magistrate arriving within the hour on the pretext of a social call, and Margaret Vale waiting upstairs with a 5-year-old letter in her hand, and the Duke Nathaniel one thin wall away, close enough to hear a scream, promising himself over and over that he would trust her to swim. Eleanor received Calvin Reed in the West office alone in her plain gray dress, with the household ledgers open on the desk between them and her own cracked leather ledger nowhere in sight. "Your Grace," Reed said warmly, setting down his folio, taking the seat across from her without being asked exactly as he always did. "May I say, married life becomes you. You look less frightened than the last time we spoke. I'm glad of it. Truly. I've worried about you, you know. A clever woman in a cold house. It's a hard road." "It has been," Eleanor agreed, and let her voice tremble just slightly, just enough. "I'll confess, Mr. Reed, I'm glad you've come. These old accounts they've quite defeated me. There are sums here I can't make balance no matter how I try, and I've been afraid to take them to His Grace because I don't want him thinking he's married a fool." A small, rueful, frightened smile. "You said once you'd explain them to me. I find I'd be grateful for the help. I'm so close to understanding, and I can't quite get there alone." And Calvin Reed's warm, gentle, patient smile spread across his face. The smile he'd smiled at Cornelia Vale's funeral, the smile of a man who has just been handed exactly the opening he came for by a plain, quiet girl 5 days behind him, who has no idea, none at all, that she's already lost. "Of course, my dear," he said, and opened his folio and drew out a paper and reached for the pen. "Of course I'll help you. Let's get you there together. Just here, if you'd only put your name just here, and I'll walk you through the whole of it, and you'll see there was never anything to be frightened of at all." He slid the paper across the desk. He held out the pen, and Eleanor Whitmore looked at the transfer that would sweep away the last of her father's stolen house, drawn in the same hand that had drowned a girl in a mill pond, and she understood that the whole of it, her father, Cornelia, the grand hall, the 11 days, the thing Nathaniel had handed her to lose, had come down to this single moment, and this single pen, and whether she could hold her plain, quiet face for 30 seconds more. She reached for the pen. Her hand did not shake. And in the next room, one thin wall away, a lawyer and a magistrate and a duke held their breath. Her hand did not shake, and that was the first thing that saved her, because a shaking hand would have told Reed something was wrong, and everything depended on nothing being wrong. She took the pen. She drew the transfer paper toward her. She read it slowly, plodding the way she'd taught him to expect her to read, and Reed sat back in his chair with the warm, patient satisfaction of a man watching a plan he'd run a dozen times run smoothly one more time. "Just there, my dear," he said gently. "At the bottom, where the line is." "I see the line," Eleanor said. "I only want to understand what I'm signing first. You'll forgive me. My father always said, You can't understand a ledger by its last page. Reed smiled. Yes, you told me. A wise man, your father. Take your time. This is a reconciliation of the household accounts. Eleanor read aloud, tracing the words with one finger like a schoolgirl. It moves the closing balances of the past 2 years into a single settlement account to clear the books before I take over their management. Is that right? Precisely right. You've a good head for it. And this settlement account. Eleanor looked up. Where is it? I don't see it named on the household ledger. The smallest pause. It's a holding account, my dear, a convenience. The bank keeps it. It's where balances rest between one management and the next. Nothing to trouble yourself over. Sign, and it all tidies itself away. Ah. Eleanor looked back down. A holding account. At the bank. She set the tip of the pen to the paper, and Reed leaned forward just slightly, the way a man leans toward a thing he's about to have, and then she lifted the pen again. And whose name is on it? The pause was longer this time. Does it matter? Your Grace? It's only that I'll be signing money into it, Eleanor said, mild as milk. And I'd feel a fool signing money into an account and not knowing whose name held it. His Grace's, I assume, the Ashcroft Estates. The Ashcroft Estates? Reed said. Of course. And Eleanor set down the pen, not sharply, not with any drama. She simply set it down on the desk and folded her hands and looked at Calvin Reed with her plain, steady gray eyes and said in the same mild voice she'd used the whole while, That's the second lie you've told me in 5 minutes. Mr. Reed and I only let you tell the first one to see whether you'd tell the second. The warmth did not leave his face all at once. That was the thing about Reed. It never left all at once. It drained slow like water out of cracked ground, and what was underneath came up to meet it just as slowly, so that for a moment his face held both things, the kindness and the cold, layered over each other like two men wearing the same skin. I beg your pardon, he said. There's no settlement account in the Ashcroft Estates name at any bank in Boston, Eleanor said. I know because I asked Mr. Prentice to look 10 days ago, the same day he looked for your letter of appointment and couldn't find it. There's no holding account. There's no convenience where balances rest between managements. You invented it just now, warm and gentle the way you invent everything, and you'd have had me sign my father's last money into an account with your name on it, and thanked me for my good head for figures. She unfolded her hands. So let's stop. I'm tired, Mr. Reed. I've been tired for 2 years, and never more than these last 12 days, and I find I haven't the strength left to sit here and let you be kind to me while you rob a dead man's daughter. Let's just stop. For a long moment, Calvin Reed said nothing. Then the last of the warmth drained out of his face, and it did not come back, and what was left was the thing Eleanor had seen for one instant in the West office 11 days ago, flat, cold, quick, and entirely without a floor. You knew, he said. When you sat down, you knew there was no account. I've known for 10 days. Then why? And she watched him do. The arithmetic watched it move behind his eyes, watched him arrive at the answer, and hate it. You let me come. You let me sit down and open my folio and slide the paper across and hold out the pen. You wanted me to reach for it. His voice was very soft. It's a trap. You've built a trap, and I've walked into the middle of it, and you're stalling me. You're keeping me talking. His eyes cut to the wall, to the thin wall 1 room away. Who's in the next room, Your Grace? Eleanor did not answer. Who is in the next room? Reed said again, and he was on his feet now, the chair scraping back the folio forgotten, and for the first time in 12 years, there was fear in Calvin Reed's voice. Not much a threat of it, but real. The magistrate. You brought the magistrate to a social call. God, the magistrate's carriage. I saw it on the drive. I thought you clever little. Sit down, Mr. Reed. I will not sit down. Sit down, Eleanor said, and something in her voice, some flat certainty, actually stopped him. Because if you go for that door, you'll find it's the stupidest thing you've done in 12 years of being the cleverest man in every room, and I'd hate for you to spoil a fine record on your last afternoon of freedom. There are men in this house who'd very much like you to run Mr. Reed. Running is what guilty men do. Running is what a magistrate remembers. So sit down, and let's finish this, like the two clever people we both are, because there's one thing left I want from you, and you're going to give it to me, and then you can decide whether to run. Reed did not sit, but he did not go for the door either. He stood poised between the two, and Eleanor saw him weighing at the odds, the exits, the 12 years of everyone being too polite to ask, and she pressed into the gap before he could finish the sum. "You killed Cornelia Vale," she said. The room went absolutely still. "That's the thing I want from you." Eleanor went on, quiet and relentless. "Not the money. The money's already lost to you. Prentice has the proof of the theft, the missing appointment, the forged clause in my father's loan. The same clause you ran on the Vale's in-laws 5 years ago. You're finished for the theft, Mr. Reed. You were finished the moment you slid that paper across the desk in front of witnesses, and no 6 bribed clerks will save you now. The theft is done." She stood slowly so that they faced each other across the desk. "But Cornelia Vale drowned in a mill pond she'd swum in since she was 6 3 days after she found your clause in her family's accounts, and everyone called it an accident, and you smiled at her funeral. And I want to hear you say it, here, now, with a magistrate 1 wall away." Reed's face had gone the color of ash. "You can't prove—" "I have her letter." And there was the crack. Not in his composure. In something deeper, something under the composure, some load-bearing beam he'd trusted for 5 years to hold, because he'd killed the only girl who could name him, and taken the risk that a 17-year-old sister's grief would never harden into evidence. "There is no letter," he said, but his voice had changed, gone thin, and Eleanor heard the 5-year-old fear in it that he'd never quite let himself feel. "She didn't. There was nothing I made certain there was." He stopped. He heard himself. Eleanor watched him. Hear himself watch the words "I made certain" hang in the air between them, and watched Calvin Reed understand 1 heartbeat too late that he had, just for the first time in 12 years, said a true thing out loud in a room he didn't control. "You made certain there was nothing," Eleanor repeated softly. "How, Mr. Reed? How does a man make certain a drowned girl left nothing behind? By searching her things? By burning her papers? You'd have had to move fast 3 days. You said, no, I said 3 days, and you didn't correct me. You'd have had to get into the Vale house between the letter and the mill pond and make certain. Which means you knew about the letter before she died. Which means you knew she'd found you before she drowned. Which means the mill pond was not an accident. And you have just told me so, in your own voice, in your own words, with the county magistrate, listening through a wall you can't see through." Reed's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And the door to the next room opened. The magistrate came first, old Judge Halloway, whom Eleanor had met exactly once at a dinner 10 days past, and spent the whole of that dinner, quietly, patiently, plainly convincing that the new Duchess of Ashcroft was a sensible woman worth listening to. Behind him came Prentice, the lawyer, gray and spare, with the founding papers of the estate under his arm, and the letter proving no appointment existed. And behind Prentice, last filling the doorway, came Nathaniel. He was not cold now. Whatever the wall had cost him, standing on the far side of it, 1 room from his wife and a murderer promising himself to trust her to swim. It had burned the last of the ice out of him. And what stood in the doorway was a man barely holding himself still. "I heard it," Judge Halloway said. He was looking at Reed, and his old face was terrible. "I heard the theft, Reed, plain as day, the account with no name, and the paper you slid across. That alone will finish you. But I heard the other thing, too. I made certain there was nothing. I've been 40 years on the bench, and I know a confession when a man trips over one." He shook his head slowly. "Cornelia Vale. Good God. Her father was a friend of mine. We called it an accident. We all called it an accident, and buried a clever girl, and dined with her murderer for 5 years. Your Honor," Reed said. And Eleanor watched him reach one last time, desperate for the warm and gentle voice, the voice that had worked for 12 years, the voice that had made a whole county thank a thief and mourn beside a murderer. "Your Honor, this is a woman scorned a bitter bride. She's twisted a few careless words." "Try it," Nathaniel said from the doorway. "Just that. 2 words." But there was something in them that stopped Reed's warm voice dead in his throat, because it was the voice of a man who had spent 12 years being managed by that gentleness, and had finally learned to hear the rot under it. "Try the voice, Reed," Nathaniel said, stepping into the room. "The kind one, the gentle one, the one you used on me for 12 years, while you turned me into a man who could call his own wife ugly to a room full of strangers. Go on, use it on the judge, use it on Prentice. It won't work, and do you know why? Because there's finally someone in the room who's immune to it." He looked at Eleanor, and something passed between them, quick and private through all the noise. "She was never charmed by you, not for 1 second. From the first morning she sat in that chair and let you think you were leading her. You've spent 12 years running a scheme that only works on people who want to be charmed, and you finally met the one person in Massachusetts who wanted the truth more than she wanted to be comfortable. That's what beat you, Reed. Not the magistrate, not the lawyer. A plain girl in a gray dress who wouldn't be charmed." Reed looked around the room at the judge, at the lawyer, at the Duke, at the paper still lying on the desk with its account that had no name, and Eleanor watched the last calculation run behind his eyes, watched him search every exit one final time, and watched him find them all closed. And then Calvin Reed did the thing that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, the thing that told her more about the nature of the man than all the forgeries and all the warmth, and even the mill pond. He smiled. The warm smile, the gentle one, the one from the funeral. He put it on like a coat, deliberately, knowingly, in a room where it could no longer save him, and he turned it on Eleanor, and he said soft and almost fond, "Cornelia begged, at the end, in the water. Did her sister's letter tell you that she begged and I held her under, and she was clever right to the last? She kept trying to bargain, kept offering me things, money, silence. And I remember thinking even then, what a waste, what a clever girl, if only she'd been content to be charmed." His eyes did not leave Eleanor's face. "I'm telling you this because you'll never be free of it now. You wanted the truth. Here it is. You'll hear her begging every time you close your eyes, the same as I have for 5 years, and you'll learn what I learned, that being clever enough to find the truth and being strong enough to carry it are two different things, and the second one is heavier than you know." It was meant to break her. Eleanor understood that even as the words landed, understood that this was Reed's last theft, the theft of her peace, the one thing he could still take from her, even with the law closing around his wrists. He wanted to put Cornelia's drowning inside her and leave it there to rot the way it had rotted in him, so that his last act would be to make one more clever girl carry what he couldn't. And Eleanor felt it try to land. Felt the horror of it, the water, the begging that held her under. Felt it reach for the soft place in her that 2 years of grief had worn thin. Then she thought of Margaret Vale, weeping in the East sitting room, setting down 5 years of guilt that was never hers. She thought of her own father gripping her wrist. She thought of a girl at the bottom of a mill pond who had been clever and proud and alone, and who had deserved so much better than to become a lesson in a murderer's mouth. And Eleanor did not break. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think I'll carry it the way you have, Mr. Reed. And I'll tell you why, because you've told me a great many true things this afternoon, and I'll give you one in return." She stepped around the desk closer to him, then was wise close enough to see the fear he was hiding under the smile. "You've carried Cornelia for 5 years because you carried her alone. That's the whole of your suffering. If you've suffered at all, you did a monstrous thing, and you had no one to tell, no one to share the weight, because the weight was your guilt, and guilt can't be shared, only confessed. But I'm not carrying Cornelia alone. I'm carrying her with her sister who loved her, with a judge who'll see her named, with a lawyer who'll see her avenged, with a husband who—" Her voice caught just slightly, "who stood on the far side of a wall and trusted me to bring her killer to this room. I don't carry Cornelia the way you do, Mr. Reed. You carry a secret. I carry a purpose. And a purpose shared among people who love each other is the lightest heavy thing in the whole world." She held his eyes. "You wanted to leave me broken, but you've only shown me the difference between us. You were alone your whole clever life, and it made you a monster. I was alone for 25 years, And then 11 days ago, a cold man in a grand hall accidentally gave me people. That's the only difference between you and me, Calvin Reed. Loneliness. And it turns out it's the only difference that ever mattered. For one moment, one single moment, something moved behind Calvin Reed's eyes that was not calculation and was not cold. It might have been grief. It might have been the ghost of the man he'd been before the first theft, before the first mill pond, before he'd decided that loneliness was safer than trust. Eleanor would never be sure, but it was there for a heartbeat, and then it was gone, and the warm smile came back down over it like a lid. Because that was the only face Calvin Reed had left to die behind. "Judge Holloway," Eleanor said without looking away from Reed, "I believe you have what you need." "I have more than I need," the old judge said heavily. "God help me. I have enough to hang him 3 times over and enough to reopen a grave that should never have been closed." He nodded to the 2 men who had come with him. Constables, Eleanor realized, who'd been waiting in the next room the whole while, and they came forward with irons. And Calvin Reed did not run because there was nowhere left to run, and a running man is remembered, and even now, even finished, Reed could not quite let go of managing how he'd be remembered. They put the irons on him. And as they turned him toward the door, Reed looked back over his shoulder one last time at the plain girl in the gray dress who had done in 12 days what no one had done in 12 years. And he said the thing that Eleanor understood finally to be the truest thing he'd ever said to anyone. "They should never have called you the ugly one." Then they took him out, and the West office was quiet, and it was over the theft, the hunt, the 11 days, the thing that had killed Cornelia Vale and ruined Silas Whitmore and frozen Nathaniel Ashcroft into a man who bought wives like coins. It was over. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had held her plain, quiet face through the grand hall and the wedding and the whole of that terrible afternoon, who had not shaken when she took the pen and had not broken, when Reed described the water, felt her legs go all at once, the strength running out of them like water out of cracked ground. Nathaniel caught her. He crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her before she reached the floor. And he did not say anything clever or cold. He only held her there in the West office with the judge and the lawyer politely finding reasons to look at the papers on the desk. And Eleanor pressed her face into his coat and finally, after 2 years and 12 days, let herself fall apart. "I heard all of it," Nathaniel said low into her hair. "Every word, through the wall. When he told you about the water, I had my hand on the door. Prentice had to hold my arm. I nearly ruined the whole thing because I couldn't stand to let you carry it alone 1 second longer." "But you didn't." Eleanor's voice was muffled against him. "You trusted me to swim." "It was the hardest thing I've ever done." "I know." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and her plain face was wet, and her gray eyes were red, and she had never in her life looked less like a duchess, or more like exactly what she was, a tired, brave, grieving woman who had carried far too much for far too long. "It was the hardest thing you've ever done, and you did it, and that's how I know you've changed. 11 days ago, you'd have broken down the door to catch him, because catching him was all that mattered. Today you nearly broke down the door to save me, and you didn't, because you understood that saving me and trusting me were the same thing." She let out a breath that was half a sob and half a laugh. "You've learned to let something cost you, Nathaniel. That's all growing up ever is. Learning to let the right things cost you." Behind them, Judge Holloway cleared his throat gently. "Your Grace," he said, and it took Eleanor a moment to understand he meant her, that she was Your Grace, now that the plain Whitmore girl was the Duchess of Ashcroft, and a judge was addressing her with grave respect. "Forgive an old man for intruding, but I'd be failing my office if I didn't say it. What you did here today, the way you built this, the patience of it, the sheer nerve I've seen prosecutors with 30 years training who couldn't have laid that trap. You caught a man who'd escaped every net for over a decade, and you caught him clean in his own words with the law watching. If you'd been born a man, madam, you'd be sitting on a bench somewhere, doing a great deal of good." "If I'd been born a man," Eleanor said, straightening, wiping her eyes, finding her feet, "no one would have underestimated me, and I'd never have caught him at all. Being underestimated was the only weapon I had, Your Honor. Reed spent 12 years counting on everyone being too polite to look under the surface. I spent my whole life being the surface no one looked under. It turns out that's exactly the right training for hunting a man like him. A tired ghost of a smile. There's a lesson in that somewhere, though. I'm too worn out to find it just now. The lesson, Prentice said dryly, speaking for nearly the first time, is that this county owes its Duchess a debt it will never know it owes because the whole affair will be kept quiet, as these things are, and half the people who laughed at her in that hall will go to their graves believing His Grace married beneath him. The old lawyer looked at her over his spectacles. Does that trouble you, Your Grace, that they'll never know? Eleanor considered it. No, she said finally. I spent 25 years not being seen, Mr. Prentice. I'm rather good at it, and I've learned something these 12 days that I wish I'd learned younger. It was never being seen that I wanted. I thought it was. I thought if they'd only look under the hood, only count what I carried, only notice, but that's not it at all. She looked up at Nathaniel. What I wanted was to be understood. By someone. Even one person. And being seen and being understood are as different as being charmed and being told the truth. Reed was seen by the whole county for 12 years and understood by no one, and it made him a monster. I'd rather be understood by one person and invisible to the rest of the world than seen by everyone and known by nobody. I've got the one person now. The county can think what it likes. There was a silence. And then Margaret Vale, who had come down the stairs when she heard the constables who had been standing in the doorway long enough to see Reed taken away in irons. Margaret Vale, beautiful and ruined, and 5 years lighter than she'd been that morning, crossed the room and did the thing that no one, least of all Eleanor, expected. She took Eleanor's hands in both of hers the way Reed once had, except that where Reed's hands had been warm and dry and false, Margaret's were cold and shaking and true. He named her, Margaret said. Her voice was barely there. Through the wall. I heard him. He said Cornelia's name and he confessed, and now there'll be a record, a real one. A court will say it out loud. My sister was murdered, and here is the man who did it. Her eyes overflowed. For 5 years I've watched people say her name like it was an embarrassment. The Vale girl who drowned. So careless, so sad. And now they'll have to say it like it means something. Like she mattered. Like she was clever and brave, and she found something monstrous, and she died for it. She gripped Eleanor's hands harder. You did that. The woman I mocked in that hall. The woman I told God I told you girls like you don't get to keep things. And you turned around and gave me back my sister's name. How does a person even begin to... You already did, Eleanor said gently. You came down the stairs 3 days after the wedding and handed me a letter you'd been too frightened to open for 5 years. That was the bravest thing anyone did in this whole affair, Margaret. Braver than the trap. Braver than the pen. I built a clever machine, and I'm proud of it, but a clever machine needs one true thing at its center, or it catches nothing, and Cornelia's letter was the true thing. You gave me that, so we're square. More than square. You don't owe me for your sister's name. We found it together, you and I, the pretty Vale girl, and the plain Whitmore one, which I suspect is exactly the kind of thing Cornelia would have found funny if I understand her at all from one letter. A real smile, now small and worn. Was she funny? Your sister. And Margaret Vale laughed, a wet, cracked, astonished laugh. The laugh of a woman who has not been asked a kind question about her dead sister in 5 years. She was awful, Margaret said, wiping her face. She was so awful. She'd have hated every dress I own and told me so. She'd have adored you. Oh, she'd have adored you. She'd have wanted to take you apart and see how you worked. And then, the laugh broke back into tears. But different tears, softer ones, the kind that heal instead of drown. And Eleanor held the beautiful, cruel, grieving woman she'd made an ally of, and thought that this too was a thing. Reed could never have understood that the people he'd tried to divide and manage and drown had at the end simply held on to each other and that holding on had turned out to be the one thing he had no weapon against. Later, much later, after the judge and the lawyer and the constables had gone after Margaret had been sent home in the Ashcroft carriage with a promise that she'd return after the long, slow business of a monstrous day. Winding down to quiet, Eleanor found Nathaniel in the West office again. Alone, standing at the window with his back half turned the way he always stood in rooms he was still learning to trust. "It's yours now," she said from the doorway. "The estate. All of it clean, no thief in the ledgers. Prentice will help you set it right. You'll have to learn to read your own accounts, Your Grace, because I'll not do it for you. I'll teach you, but I'll not do it. A man who can't read his own money is a man waiting for the next Calvin Reed." "I know." He didn't turn from the window. "Eleanor, there's something I have to say, and I've been standing here an hour working out how to say it, and I still don't know, so I'll just say it badly." He turned. "Your father. The debt. Reed's finished and the forgery's proven, which means the loan's void, which means your father's house is safe. It's done. As of an hour ago. I've already told Prentice to draw up the papers clearing it. You did what you came to do, Eleanor. Your father won't lose his house. You've won." Eleanor stood very still. She had known it. Of course had known it since Reed slid the paper across the desk. But she had been so deep in the fight that she hadn't let herself feel the far side of it. After the thing she'd been running toward for 2 years without ever quite believing she'd reach. Her father would keep his house. Silas Whitmore, who could no longer hold a pen, who had gripped her wrist, and said for the family who blamed himself for a debt he never earned. He would die when he died in his own house, with his name intact, never knowing that his plain, overlooked daughter had walked into a duke's hall and torn a murderer out of the walls to save it. "He'll never know," Eleanor said softly. "That's the strange part. I'll keep it from him. The murder, the trap, all of it. He's too frail, it would only frighten him. I'll tell him the debt was a clerk's error corrected. And he'll be relieved, and he'll pat my hand, and he'll say what a good girl I am for keeping the books tidy, and he'll never know." Her voice thickened. "He'll never know what I did for him. And I find I don't mind. I thought I would. I thought I wanted him to know. But it's like I told Prentice. I never wanted to be seen. I wanted to matter. And I'll know I mattered even if he doesn't, and that turns out to be enough. It turns out it was always enough." Nathaniel crossed the room. He stood before her, and he did not take her hands, and he did not kiss her forehead, and he did not do any of the small managed gestures that a colder man would have reached for. He simply looked at her, plain, gray, exhausted, magnificent. And he said the thing that he had been standing at the window for an hour, trying to find the words for, and he found them at last, and they were very simple. "I see you," he said. "I know you don't need it. I know you'd rather be understood than seen, and I understand you, Eleanor. I do better than I've understood anyone in my life. But I need you to hear it anyway, because I'm the man who stood in a hall 12 days ago and called you ugly, and I can't take that back. I'll never take it back, but I can stand here now and tell you the truth that unmakes it." He took a breath. "I see you, all the way down, and there is nothing plain about you. There never was. The whole county looked at you and saw gray wool and a quiet girl. And I did too. God forgive me, I did too. And every one of us was blind because you were the most extraordinary person in that hall the entire time. And it took me 12 days and a murderer and a wall between us to learn to see it." His voice dropped. "So I'll say it once, and then I'll never call you plain again, and I'll spend however long you'll let me proving I meant it. You are the least ugly thing I have ever seen in my life, and I'm so sorry it took me so long to look." Eleanor Whitmore, who had not broken in the grand hall or at the wedding, or when Reed described the water broke then quietly completely in the arms of the man who had wronged her worst and grown the most in a house that had not wanted her 12 days ago and could not now imagine itself without her. And outside the long summer evening came down soft over the valley, and somewhere 40 miles away, a dying man slept easy in a house he would keep. And somewhere in the county jail, a gentle-faced monster waited to answer at last for a girl in a mill pond. And somewhere in the East Wing, a 5-year-old letter lay open on a desk beside a cracked leather ledger. The pretty sister's grief and the plain sister's purpose finally laid down side by side. It was over. And it was Eleanor understood holding on to Nathaniel in the fading light only just beginning. It was only just beginning, and Eleanor learned exactly how much so 3 mornings later, when the letter came from Boston that turned everything she thought was finished upside down. It came in Prentice's careful hand, and Nathaniel read it first at the breakfast table, and Eleanor watched his face change, and knew before he said a word that they had not won as cleanly as they'd believed. "Reed's talking," Nathaniel said. He set the letter down slowly. "From the jail. He's asked for the judge, and he's Eleanor. He's not confessing. He's bargaining. He says he'll give up the whole of it, every family he robbed, every account, 12 years of it, in exchange for his life. No hanging, transportation instead, and Holloway's considering it." Considering it. Eleanor set down her cup. Why would Holloway consider letting Cornelia's murderer live? Because Reed says he didn't work alone. The words landed in the quiet breakfast room like a stone dropped down a well. He says there was a partner. Nathaniel went on, and his voice had gone flat and careful, the way a man's voice goes when he's afraid of what the next sentence will do. Someone above him. Someone who took the lion's share, while Reed did the forging and the mill ponds. He says the scheme was never his to begin with. He says he was recruited into it 12 years ago by someone who's still out there, still respectable, still robbing families across 3 counties, and he'll name that person, but only if he lives to stand as a witness. He looked up at her. Holloway thinks it might be true. A scheme that big run that long across that many families, Prentice agrees it's hard to credit one solicitor managed it alone. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "He's lying," she said. "Eleanor, he's lying, Nathaniel, and I'll tell you exactly how I know, because it's the same tell he had at the desk." She stood and began to pace the ledger, pacing, the mind moving ahead of the mouth. Reed's entire craft, his whole craft, the thing that let him run this for 12 years, was making himself indispensable and unquestioned. He didn't share. Sharing means witnesses, and witnesses mean risk, and Reed murdered a 17-year-old girl rather than accept the risk of one letter. A man who'll drown a child to protect a secret does not have a partner. He can't. His whole nature forbids it. The partner is his last forgery. He's invented a phantom above himself because he understands something about men like Holloway, that I understand too, that a big fish will always tempt them into sparing a smaller one. He's dangling a monster that doesn't exist to trade for his own neck. And if it works, he sails to a penal colony instead of the gallows. And in 3 years, he's charming a warden, and in 5, he's escaped or pardoned or simply free. And there's a new mill pond in a new county for a new clever girl. She stopped. He is not done, Nathaniel. That's the thing I keep having to learn about Calvin Reed. He is never, ever done. Even in irons, he's running a scheme. Nathaniel stared at her. Then we have to stop Holloway from taking the bargain. We have to do better than that, Eleanor said. We have to prove the partner doesn't exist, and you can't prove an absence to a frightened judge with a mere argument. I learned that lesson from the missing letter of appointment. Holloway won't hang a man on my feeling. He'll want the phantom disproved. Which means... And here, her face went still and cold, and Nathaniel watched her arrive at something she didn't like. Which means I have to go to the jail. I have to sit across from him one more time, and I have to make him tell me the partner's name. Absolutely not. Nathaniel. You sat across from him once and he described a drowning to break you. Nathaniel said, on his feet now. You want to sit across from him again in a cell where he has nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect, and no reason on earth to do anything but hurt you as much as he can before they hang him. No. I trusted you to swim once and it nearly killed me. I won't do it twice. You have to, Eleanor said quietly, because there's no one else who can. Think, Nathaniel. Think about who Reed is. He'll never give the name to Holloway. A name to Holloway saves his life, so he'll hoard it, dole it out, drag the bargain on for months. He'll never give it to Prentice. Prentice is a lawyer. Reed reads lawyers the way I read ledgers. But me? She pressed a hand flat against her chest, the old gesture. I'm the one who beat him. I'm the only person who's ever beaten him, and men like Reed cannot bear to be beaten by someone they think is beneath them. And that need, that wound, that vanity, is the one thing in him I can still use. He doesn't want to give me the truth. He wants to give me the last word. If I go to that cell, and I let him think he's got one final chance to prove he was cleverer than the plain girl all along, he'll reach for it, the same way he reached for the pen. It's the only move he has left, and he can't not make it. His whole nature forbids restraint, remember. I'll turn that against him one last time. Nathaniel closed his eyes. You're describing walking into a cage with an animal, he said, and using its own hunger to make it bite the bars. Yes. And there's no other way. There's no other way that ends with Cornelia's murderer on a gallows instead of a ship, Eleanor said. And I promised Margaret. I promised her sister's name would be the thing that hanged him. I don't break promises like that, Nathaniel. Not that one. Not ever. He was quiet a long time. And then he did the thing that told her more than any word could have how far he'd come from the man in the grand hall. He didn't forbid her, and he didn't try to manage her, and he didn't offer to go in her place. He simply said, then I'll be on the other side of the door, every second. And this time, Eleanor, this time, if you need me, you don't have to scream. Just say my name, once, and I'll come through that door and to hell with the whole county and every phantom partner Reed can invent. He took her hands. That's my one condition. Not that you don't go. Only that you take me with you as far as the door, and that you trust me to come the way I trusted you to swim. Can you give me that, Nathaniel? It's the same thing you asked of me, Eleanor. Let the right thing cost you. Let me cost you. Say yes. And Eleanor, who had spent 25 years keeping nothing precious where the world could reach it, who had learned 12 days ago to hold a thing she could lose, looked at her husband and understood that this was the next lesson harder than the last, not just to hold something precious, but to let someone hold you. Yes, she said, as far as the door, and I'll say your name. The county jail was 3 hours' ride, and they made it in silence, and Eleanor spent the whole of it not rehearsing what she'd say because you couldn't rehearse Reed. He'd only turn your rehearsals against you, but rather doing the thing she always did, the thing that was her real gift, quieter and deeper than her head for figures. She read him. She read Calvin Reed the way she'd read him across the desk, the way she'd read the Dukes turned back in the grand hall. And she built in her mind the shape of a man in a cell 3 days from the gallows, and she asked herself the only question that mattered. What does he want more than he wants to live? Because a man bargaining for his life wants to live. But Reed had murdered rather than risk exposure. He'd chosen his secret over another person's life more than once. Which meant there was something Reed valued above his own survival, something that had driven every choice he'd made, and if she could find it, she could beat him one last time. By the time they reached the jail, she had it. She knew what Calvin Reed wanted more than he wanted to live, and it was a terrible thing to know, and she carried it into the stone corridor like a blade. They let her into the cell alone. Nathaniel stood at the door. She could feel him there, a warmth at her back through the iron, and Reed looked up from the cot where he sat, and the warm, gentle smile came up over his face, even now, even here, because it was the only face he had. Your Grace, he said. I confess I hoped you'd come. Holloway sends lawyers. I've no use for lawyers. But you... The smile deepened. You I've been wanting to finish our conversation with. You've invented a partner, Eleanor said. She did not sit. There was nowhere she'd have sat in that cell. There isn't one. I know there isn't one. And I've come to hear you admit it, and then to watch you hang for a girl you drowned, and I'll be honest with you, Mr. Reed, because you were honest with me once I did not want to come. My husband begged me not to. I came anyway because I made a promise to Margaret Vale, and because I am the only person alive who can make you tell the truth, and we both know why that is. Do we? Because you can't bear that I beat you. Eleanor watched the smile flicker. You've spent 3 days in this cell, and it isn't the gallows eating at you. It's me. It's a plain girl in a gray dress who sat across a desk and let you slide the paper and hold out the pen and thought you were leading her the whole time when she was leading you. That's what's keeping you awake, Mr. Reed. Not death. Death you can manage, you're managing it right now with your phantom partner and your bargain. But being beaten, by me, by someone the whole county called ugly, that you can't manage at all. The smile was gone now. You want the last word? Eleanor went on, relentless quiet. It's the only thing you've wanted your whole life, if I've read you right, and I've read you very right. Not the money was only a way of keeping score. What you wanted was to be the cleverest man in every room, and to have no one ever know it, because a secret genius is the safest kind. You wanted to win, and win, and win, and never be seen winning. And I took that from you. I saw you win, and then I beat you. And now the one thing you cannot stand is that the last chapter of Calvin Reed's clever life is a plain girl outsmarted him. You'd do anything to change that ending. You'd even give up the gallows bargain. You'd throw away your own life for one chance to prove you were cleverer than me after all. Reed said nothing, but his hands on his knees had gone white at the knuckles. So here's what I've come to offer you, Eleanor said. Not a bargain for your life. I can't give you that, and I wouldn't if I could. Something better. Something you want more. She leaned in just slightly. I'll tell the whole county you beat me. The cell went very still. I'll tell them the plain Whitmore girl was made a fool of by Calvin Reed, Eleanor said softly. I'll let Margaret spread it and Halloway and Prentice. I'll let it be the story that you almost got away with it, that you nearly had me signing that transfer, that it was luck and not cleverness that caught you, that in a fair fight, the solicitor outwitted the Duchess. I'll give you the ending you want, Mr. Reed. The one where you were the cleverest man in the room right to the last. I'll carve it into your legend myself. She paused. In exchange for the truth about the partner, told plainly to me right now with my husband listening at that door. There's no partner, and you'll say so. And in exchange, I'll let the whole world believe you very nearly won. It was the cruelest thing Eleanor had ever done. And she knew it, even as she did it, and she did it anyway. Because it was the one trap left that Calvin Reed could not escape, the trap of his own vanity, baited with the only thing he'd ever truly hungered for, dangled by the only person who could give it to him. And she watched him want it. She watched Calvin Reed, 3 days from death, sit in a stone cell and want to be remembered as clever, more than he wanted to keep. Breathing, watched the hunger rise in him. Naked, now stripped of the warm, gentle mask. Because the mask had never been for this. The mask had been for the world, and there was no world in this cell. Only the one person who'd beaten him, and was offering to unbeat him in the eyes of everyone who'd ever mattered. There's no partner, Reed said. It came out of him quietly, almost with relief, the way a confession comes when a man has held a thing too long. There was never a partner. It was mine, all of it, 12 years, every family, every account. I built it alone, and I ran it alone, and I did the other things alone. His eyes came up to hers, and for the first time, there was nothing in them but a terrible, naked wanting. The partner was a lie for Halloway, a big fish to trade for my neck. You were right. You were right about all of it, you clever, clever girl. You were right the whole way through. The smile came back, but it was different now, broken, almost pleading. Now, your side. Tell them I nearly won. Tell them Calvin Reed almost beat the Duchess of Ashcroft. Give me that. You promised. Give me that, and I'll go to the gallows content. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and then she did the thing that made her in that instant more truly the opposite of Calvin Reed than she'd ever been, the thing that separated a woman who used cleverness for love from a man who'd used it for scorekeeping. No, she said. Reed's face went slack. You confessed there's no partner, Eleanor said. My husband heard it. The guard heard it. It's done. The bargain with Halloway is dead. You'll hang for Cornelia, and there was never anything you could do to stop it once you opened your mouth just now. But I'm not going to tell the county you beat me, Mr. Reed, because you didn't. And the last thing I'll do to you, the very last thing, is refuse to let you rewrite that. You wanted to be remembered as clever. You'll be remembered as caught. You wanted the last word. The last word is no. She straightened. I lied to you. I baited a trap with your vanity, and you walked into it exactly like you walked into the one at the desk, And do you know why you'll never understand how I did it? Because you think cleverness is a weapon for winning. I know it's only a tool for protecting the people you love. That's the difference between us. It was always the difference. You could never have beaten me, because you never had anything to fight for, only things to steal. And a man who fights for nothing always loses to a woman who fights for someone. Always. In the end. Every time. And she turned and she walked to the door and she said, "Nathaniel." Not because she needed him, but because she'd promised she'd say it. And he opened the door and she walked out of Calvin Reed's cell without looking back. And behind her, the cleverest thief in 3 counties made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not warm and not gentle, and not managed a raw, broken animal sound. The sound of a man who has finally, at the very end, been made to understand that he lost and that everyone would know it, and that there was nothing left in his whole clever life to hide behind. They hanged Calvin Reed 11 days later on a bright summer morning, and the record said for the murder of Cornelia Vale, and Margaret stood in the front of the crowd with her sister's name spoken aloud at last in a court of law. And she did not cry because she'd done all her crying, and instead she stood tall and let the whole county see a Vale girl watch justice done for a Vale girl 5 years late and worth every day of the wait. Eleanor did not attend the hanging. She'd had enough of Calvin Reed to last her whole life, and she saw no reason to give him even the audience of her face at the end. She went instead to see her father. The ride to Whitmore was 40 miles, and Nathaniel came with her, and this time the silence in the carriage was a different kind. Not braced, but full. The comfortable quiet of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them. Somewhere in the second hour, Eleanor's hand found Nathaniel's on the seat, and neither of them remarked on it. And that not remarking was its own kind of language now. "He'll pat my hand," Eleanor said when the Whitmore gate came into view. "My father. He'll pat my hand and tell me I'm a good girl for keeping the books tidy, and he'll never know a single thing I did. Does that still not trouble you?" "No," she smiled. "It troubles you more than it troubles me, I think. You want him to know. You want someone to give me the credit I'm owed. It's kind of you. It's one of the ways I know you've changed, that you're angry on my behalf about a thing I made my peace with long ago." She squeezed his hand. "But I told you, Nathaniel, I never wanted to be seen. And my father, seeing me clearly at the end, frightened and frail, and finally understanding what his overlooked daughter really was, that wouldn't be a gift to him. It would be a burden. He'd spend his last strength feeling guilty for every year he didn't see me. Why would I do that to a dying man I love? No. I'll let him pat my hand. I'll let him think I'm a good girl who keeps tidy books. And I'll know the truth, and you'll know it, and that's the whole of the audience I need." Silas Whitmore was sitting up when they came in the chair by the window where he spent his days now, and he was smaller than Eleanor remembered from just 3 weeks past, the illness taking him faster, and when he saw her, his whole ruined face lit up like a boy's. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was a thread. "My Eleanor, and your Grace." He tried to rise, couldn't, and Nathaniel crossed the room fast and stopped him with a hand on his shoulder gently. "Please, sir, don't get up on my account. I've done nothing to earn it." "You married my girl," Silas said. That's a great deal to an old man who thought no one ever would." His eyes came back to Eleanor, and they were wet. "They wrote to me. The bank. The debt, they say it's cleared. A clerk's error, they said, corrected. 12 years of a clerk's error, and it's simply gone." His hand found hers, and it was so light now, so weightless, and he patted it exactly as she'd said he would. "I don't understand it, Eleanor. I've lain awake 3 weeks not understanding it. That debt was killing me faster than the fever, and now it's gone, and I keep thinking there's something I'm not being told, some catch, some... There's no catch, Father." Eleanor knelt by his chair and took both his weightless hands in hers. "It was an error. It's corrected. Your house is safe. You'll stay here in your own home with your own name for as long as—" Her voice caught just slightly, and she steadied it. "For as long as you like. That's all. That's the whole of it. There's nothing you're not being told that would make you anything but glad." And Silas Whitmore looked at his plain, overlooked good girl daughter, And something moved across his dying face that Eleanor had not expected and had not braced for and could not have stopped if she'd tried. "You did something," he said softly. "Didn't you?" Eleanor went still. "I'm old, Eleanor. I'm dying. But I'm not a fool, and I was never a fool whatever these last years of being carried about have made me look like." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "A clerk's error doesn't fix itself the same month my daughter marries the man who held the debt. I've spent 3 weeks pretending not to see the shape of it because I thought you wanted me not to see it. But I see it. I've always seen more than you thought. You kept my books for a year and a half, and you never once let me see how frightened you were, and I let you not let me because I hadn't the strength to carry your fear on top of mine." His eyes overflowed. "I saw it, Eleanor. I saw all of it. I've been seeing you your whole life and letting you think I didn't, because you seem to want so badly to be left alone to be strong. Was that wrong of me? Tell me now while I can still hear it. Was I wrong to leave you unseen when I could have?" "No," Eleanor said, and now she was crying too openly, in a way she had not cried even in Nathaniel's arms in the West office. "No, Father. You weren't wrong. You gave me the only thing that let me survive. You let me be small so no one would look, so I could learn to do the things a seen girl never gets the freedom to do. You made me invisible, and it turned out invisible was a weapon, the best weapon I ever had, and I used it, and I saved your house, and I'd do it 100 times over." She pressed his light hands to her wet face. "And you saw me the whole time. You saw me the whole time, and you let me think you didn't because that was what I needed. That's not a father failing to see his daughter. That's a father seeing her so clearly he gave her the exact thing she needed even when it cost him. Do you understand? You did see me. You're the first one who ever did. Before Nathaniel. Before any of them. You saw me and you loved me enough to pretend you didn't." Silas Whitmore closed his eyes, and the tears ran down into the deep lines of his ruined face. And he said so quietly, Eleanor almost missed it, "Then I can go easy. I've been waiting to know you'd be all right. That's the only thing that's kept me. And you're more than all right, aren't you? You're extraordinary. You always were. My overlooked girl. My extraordinary overlooked girl." He opened his eyes and looked past her to Nathaniel standing quiet by the window. "You, Duke, do you see her truly? Because if you don't, if you're another one who looks at that gray dress and sees a quiet girl who keeps tidy books, then I'll haunt you, I swear it. I'll haunt you to your grave." "I see her," Nathaniel said, and his own voice was rough. "I was blind once, sir. For 12 days I was as blind as the whole county. And then I learned to look, and I'll spend the rest of my life looking, and I'll never make the mistake of thinking her plain or quiet or small again. I see her, I promise you. You can go easy on that account." "Good," Silas breathed. "Good. Then it's all right. Then it was all worth it." His eyes drifted closed again, and his hand went slack in Eleanor's, and for one terrible moment she thought. But no, his chest still rose. He was only tired, only resting the way the dying rest more and more until the resting becomes the thing itself. "Sit with me a while, Eleanor, both of you. Just sit with me. I want to be seen a while too. It's been so long since anyone looked at me and saw anything but a sick old man in a chair." So they sat with him. They sat with Silas Whitmore through the long, bright summer afternoon, and Eleanor held his hand, and Nathaniel sat on his other side, and they did not talk of debts or dukes or the things Eleanor had done, but of small, ordinary things of the garden. Silas could see from his window of a horse he'd loved 40 years past, of the funny, stubborn way Eleanor had learned to read as a child, teaching herself out of ledgers because storybooks were thought too fine for a plain girl. And Silas laughed thin and delighted, and Eleanor laughed with him, and it was the first afternoon in 2 years that had held no fear in it at all. Silas Whitmore died 9 days later in his own bed, in his own house, with his name intact and his debt cleared, and his daughter's hand in his, and he died, knowing she was safe, and knowing she was seen first by him, always by him, and now by a man who would not make his mistake. It was, Eleanor thought afterward, as good a death as a person got in this world. Better than most. Far better than he'd have had if his overlooked daughter had stayed overlooked. She grieved him hard. She'd earned the right to, and she took it. And Nathaniel did not try to manage her grief, or hurry it, or fix it. He only stayed close and let it cost him the discomfort of a house full of sorrow and learned day by day the enormous quiet work of loving someone through a loss, instead of retreating from the mess of it into cold. He was not always good at it. He was learning. That he was learning at all was the whole miracle of him. And in the autumn, when the worst of the grief had thinned to something Eleanor could carry, they had the conversation that neither had quite dared to have the conversation about what they were now to each other, past the contract, and the trap, and the shared purpose that had held them together through the summer. They had it in the West office of all places where so much had happened, and Nathaniel had it badly the way he'd warned her he would, and Eleanor let him. "The marriage was a contract," he said. "You said so yourself. You married me for a wall and a name and a chance to save your father. And I married you because I wanted a wife I'd never have to see." He turned from the window. "Both of those reasons are gone now, Eleanor. Your father's at peace. God rest him, and I see you every day, and it's the best part of every day. The contract's finished. It did what it was for. Which means we could end it if you wanted. Quietly. Prentice could arrange it. You'd keep the settlement, the security you'd never want for anything. You'd be free. Free of the man who called you ugly in a hall full of strangers. You'd never have to look at me again." He said it fast, like a man tearing off a bandage. "I'm offering you that. Because I love you, and because a man who loves you doesn't keep you in a cage he built for the wrong reasons, even a comfortable one. So it's yours. The choice. The way the choice at the very beginning was never yours. I'm giving it back to you now whole. Stay or go. And I'll honor it either way, and I'll never make you feel the weight of what I want." Eleanor listened to the whole of it, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she crossed the room to him, and she did the thing. She'd learned to do this summer, the thing that was harder than being clever, harder than laying traps, the single hardest thing she'd ever learned. She let herself be held, and she let herself hold, and she let it cost her the terrifying weight of wanting something she could lose. "Nathaniel," she said, "look at me." He looked at her. "You've just done the most extraordinary thing," she said softly. "You've offered to let me go. The man who bought me like a coin off a table 3 months ago has just offered me my freedom with nothing asked in return, because he'd rather lose me than cage me. Do you understand what that is? That's the whole distance you've traveled standing right there in one offer. The man in the grand hall couldn't have conceived of it. He thought people were things to be managed and kept. And here you are choosing to risk losing the thing you want most because loving it means letting it be free." She took his face in her hands. "You've become the exact opposite of Calvin Reed. He held everything too tight, and it made him a monster. You've just opened your hand and offered to let go of the one thing you'd fight the world for. That's not weakness, Nathaniel. That's the strongest thing I've ever watched a person do." "Then," his voice broke, "then you'll go." "I'll stay," Eleanor said. "You fool! You wonderful, changed, growing fool. I'll stay, and not because of the settlement or the security, or because I've nowhere else I could go anywhere. Now I'm the Duchess who caught the county's cleverest thief. I've a mind that terrifies lawyers, and a name that opens any door in Massachusetts. I don't need you, Nathaniel. Understand that. I'll never need you the way I needed you in the grand hall when you were a wall between my father and ruin." She smiled, and it reached all the way up into her tired gray eyes. "I'll stay because I choose you, freely, the way you just freed me to choose. Not the wall, not the name, not the contract, you. The man who learned to see, the man who trusted me to swim, the man who stood on the far side of a wall and nearly broke down a door because he couldn't stand to let me carry a thing alone 1 second longer. That man. I choose that man, and I'll keep choosing him every day, for as long as he keeps growing into himself." She pressed her forehead to his. "That's the difference between a contract and a marriage, Nathaniel. A contract you're bound to. A marriage you choose, every morning, again and again. And I'd rather choose you every morning of my life than be bound to any man on earth." And Nathaniel Ashcroft, who had walked into a grand hall in the summer and called a woman ugly to a room full of strangers, who had been made cold by a gentle thief and thawed by a plain girl in gray, put his arms around his wife and held her the way you hold a thing you've chosen and been chosen by, and for the first time in 12 years in the West Office, where so much had been lost and so much had been won. He was not lonely, and he was not cold, and he was not managing anything at all. He was simply at last home. They ran the estate together after that, and Eleanor taught him to read his own accounts, as she'd sworn she would, and she never once did it for him. And within a year, Nathaniel Ashcroft could spot a padded grocer's bill at 40 paces, and there was not a solicitor in 3 counties who'd have dared try on him what Reed had tried for 12 years. Margaret Vale came to dinner often, and the pretty Vale girl and the plain Whitmore one became the kind of friends that only 2 women who've survived the same monster can be, and Margaret married well, eventually for love, and not for money. And Eleanor stood up at her wedding, and neither of them ever forgot Cornelia. And both of them made sure the county didn't either. And the story of what really happened that summer stayed quiet the way Prentice had said it would. Half the county went to their graves believing the Duke of Ashcroft had married beneath him that the plain Whitmore girl was a lucky, mousy nobody who'd caught a cold man in a weak moment. They never knew. They never once suspected that the quiet duchess who kept such tidy books had walked into a hall full of their laughter, and without ever raising her voice, dismantled a murderer, saved a dying man's house, freed a frozen duke, and given a drowned girl back her name. Eleanor never minded that they didn't know, because she had learned the truth that Calvin Reed died never understanding the truth that had been the real prize of that whole terrible, extraordinary summer, that being seen by everyone was worth nothing, and being understood by even one person was worth everything, and that the deepest value in a human being is not the kind the world can see at a glance and applaud. It's the kind that hides under a plain gray hood, uncounted, unwatched, waiting not to be admired, but to matter. And it had mattered. It had mattered more than beauty, more than name, more than all the wealth Reed ever stole. In a world built entirely on appearances, a plain girl no one bothered to look at had turned out to be the only person strong enough to see everyone else clearly, and that clear sight, that refusal to be charmed, that plain, unglamorous, truth-telling love, had saved every single soul it touched. She never needed the world to see her. She only ever needed to matter, and she did.